In the distant Eisen Empire, where majestic mountains met endless forests, among the majestic towers stood a palace where a story full of secrets took place. The red-haired lady opened her eyes and woke up exhausted. Her long hair spread out across the pillow like flames, and her eyes reflected anxiety. The first thought that came to her mind as soon as she woke up was a painful one, because the heroine desperately wanted to die. Sitting up in bed, she confidently decided that this was how it had been in the past, and now everything would definitely be different. Approaching the mirror, the heroine saw a freckled and plump face and wavy long hair the color of a bright carrot. The heroine's cloudy turquoise eyes were full of despair, and as soon as she looked at herself, she immediately asked how painful the life of the past heroine had been. Fragments of memories, vague images, faces she couldn't identify, and a feeling that something important had been taken from her swirled around in her head. After looking around the room, which she didn't recognize at all, the heroine realized that she had just been reborn into the body of another girl. She found herself in a fantasy novel that she was reading just before her death, and it was called A Saint's Wish. In the novel, the story began like this. Arya, who had only enchanting, captivating beauty, one day realized that she was a saint. She received a calling and went to the capital, where she met all sorts of people and saved them, and there her path crossed with the main character, Crown Prince Sylvester. But at that time, the prince's position was very precarious, and he was forced to hide the curse with which he constantly fought and lived all his life. For many years he suffered from the curse, at least until he met a girl named Arya, who was a saint, and thanks to her, the curse began to weaken little by little, and after meeting her, Sylvester gradually began to overcome his difficulties. At this point, the whole story was a typical fantasy novel, and the heroine was trying to remember if there was an unusual plot twist. She wanted to remember at least some details, and finally, interesting facts began to emerge in her mind. The appearance of the second main character, the Duke of the North, named Benjamin Felton, was unusual. While the prince had a dark image, Benjamin was a good-natured man with blonde hair and gentle features. He also had warm green eyes, which didn't fit with the image of the cold Duke of the North. But what was even more surprising was that he had been married for a long time to a lovely girl whose name was kept secret. The heroine tried to understand why it was necessary to create such a backstory for the second main character, and whether the author really wanted a love drama. But now it didn't matter at all, because the heroine had been reborn and was already in another body, and little by little there was more and more grace in her, and less of her remained. The maids stood in front of their mistress and looked at each other, not understanding why the lady had woken up so sad. One of the maids was going to prepare the mistress's favorite tea, and the second promised to bring her favorite dish. You see, a new variety has recently arrived. The heroine asked the maids not to worry, and assured them that she was completely fine. But as it turned out, due to depression, the heroine locked herself in the room and did not come out. So everyone was worried, and she felt guilty that they had to worry so much. Beloved by her maids and living in a large, luxurious mansion, the heroine wondered where the original Grace had gone. Looking out the window, she decided to go for a walk outside and breathe some fresh air to finally get her thoughts in order. The maids carefully brought the mistress her favorite outfit, claiming that it would definitely lift her spirits if she wore it. The maids fussed around the mistress, and one of them even suggested that she take a bath first and then go for a walk. The heroine looked at herself in the mirror, standing in the long white dress that the maids had brought, and tried to understand who Grace was. Before her rebirth, the heroine was bedridden until her death, and even though her body is unsightly, the mere fact that she can stand on her feet already makes her happy. The maid suggested removing the mirror so that the lady would not be upset by her appearance, but she refused. Grace considered herself fat and ugly, but to be honest, the heroine was not that ugly, and she personally did not think so, but saw pleasant features in herself. For some reason, the real Grace had harbored a deep hatred for herself her entire life, and it showed on her body, and dark thoughts would constantly pop up in her head. The heroine agreed to take a hot bath and refused the help of the maids because she just wanted to be alone. She felt awkward washing herself with someone else's help, and fortunately, Grace felt awkward too, probably because she didn't like showing off her body, which she considered ugly. Having immersed herself in a hot bath, the heroine felt a pleasant warmth, and she even felt a little better. After a hot bath, the maids brought her an outfit, because this was her first walk in a long time, and it was so important to be beautiful. The lady put on a dark blue long dress, and looking at herself in the mirror, she thought only one thing. All the dresses in the lady's wardrobe seemed the same to her, and Grace was probably trying to hide her figure with the help of such outfits. After twirling around in front of the mirror for a bit, the heroine looked at her reflection again and confidently decided that she could handle everything. The former heroine rarely left her room and showed up in the palace, and due to her reincarnation, she disappeared altogether for a long time. Therefore, all the inhabitants of the estate were incredibly surprised. Their reaction was expected, but the heroine decided that now she would not take a single step back. The sun's rays filtered through the foliage of the trees, creating a play of light and shadow on the soft grass. The scent of blooming roses and jasmine filled the air, and it seemed that even nature welcomed her return. New Grace looked around and was delighted, because up close the garden was even more beautiful than from the palace windows. The maid who approached the mistress admitted that the master had excellent taste, and the garden really looked incredibly beautiful. She said that the gentleman had thought of everything so that the garden could be seen from the ladies' room, and all this beauty and grace was created just for her. Grace didn't immediately believe her words, because she knew too well what the real state of affairs of the former owner of this body was, and there were some nuances here. The sound of someone else's footsteps was heard nearby, and Grace managed to see blonde hair sparkling in the sun, as well as eyes the color of fresh green. The elegant and refined man who approached the lady was Benjamin, and he asked what brought the lady here, who had not left the room for a long time. The heroine looked at the young man with bright turquoise eyes and asked if she really shouldn't have come here. The young man's pleasant appearance charmed her, and he admitted that this was not what he had meant at all. In fact, he was simply very worried about the lady, because she had not gone out or talked to people for a long time. Grace smiled and pretended to take Benjamin at his word, but in reality she knew much more about his experiences. After all, his legal wife, who never appeared directly in the novel, is standing in front of him now. According to the novel's plot, Benjamin's wife was a red-haired lady named Grace Felton, who was never popular in aristocratic society. The red-haired heroine, named Grace Felton, was originally named Grace Linden, and Linden was her maiden name. She was the girl chosen to suppress the power of the Duke of Felton's family, and it was not through her own will that she found herself under the influence of politics and other aristocrats. Now, inside Grace, there lived another girl who had been reborn quite recently, and from now on, she was to become the real Grace Felton. In the original story, the Lindens were a minor, untitled family, and under any other circumstances, Grace would never have been able to marry into the ducal family, so she was incredibly lucky to marry Benjamin. However, she married him, having met him only 3 times before the engagement was immediately announced, and soon after that, she completely stopped appearing in social circles. Grace wished it was just a simple desire for privacy, but Benjamin was still standing next to her. The young man smiled a charming smile, because he was glad that the lady had finally gone outside and started communicating with the outside world. But Grace knew that in the end, they were not a real couple. She didn't have the best relationship with her husband, and communicating with other people didn't bring her joy. But now she didn't care at all. The reason for her true unrest is that in the second half of the story, Grace dies from an unknown illness or at the hands of her husband, which remains unknown to this day. And does this mean that even after rebirth, her death is still inevitable? And this thought never left the head of the new Grace. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, because she didn't even notice how deeply she had sunk into sad thoughts. It was Benjamin's hand, but the girl turned around, pushed his palms away from her shoulder, and looked at the young man with a menacing gaze. Benjamin did not expect such a strong reaction from his wife, and continued to look at his spouse with surprised eyes. He asked sadly if something had happened to my lady, or if he had done something wrong that could have offended her. Benjamin assumed that the girl was probably cold and needed to be escorted to her room, as she probably felt uncomfortable being outside after staying in her room for so long. Grace insisted that everything was fine, but she didn't understand why her husband was so kind to her when he was about to kill his wife. She was only a minor character who was given a couple of lines in the novel, and her death was not even described. And Benjamin's mention of his wife's death was the last mention of Grace. But after her death, Benjamin slowly began to go crazy. He increasingly began to move away from the image of a reliable and kind person, and soon became the main villain of the story. Benjamin kidnapped the main character and tried to kill her, but then clashed with the prince and ended up dying in Arya's arms, completely maddened by pain and despair. In fact, Benjamin had simply wanted human happiness all his life, but his soul was filled with anger and disappointment, and there was no turning back. There was a possibility that Benjamin loved Arya very much, and because of this, he could very well have killed his wife. But there was no clear mention of this in the novel, and Grace was not sure that this is exactly how it happened. Benjamin was her favorite character in the novel, and he often talked to Arya about his wife and spoke very positively of her. She liked that good-natured Benjamin, whose heart was noble. But if you think about it, he never really loved his wife. It was almost a betrayal, and Grace now realized what a stupid wife she had been, because someone like her could not be loved. After the walk, the heroine went to her room, and she could not stop thinking about Benjamin and the plot of the novel, feeling how hard it was for her. She wanted to walk longer, but she couldn't bring herself to tell Benjamin that she wanted to be alone, walking through the garden all by herself. Therefore, Benjamin followed his wife throughout the entire walk and did not leave her alone for a second. Grace didn't expect Benjamin to follow her around all the time, but I didn't want to drive him away, risking hurting the young man's feelings. She hadn't known what would motivate Benjamin to kill Grace earlier, and now she wondered if there was any evidence at all that the husband had killed his wife. Only a few important details remain in the hazy memories. Firstly, Grace and Benjamin were not close enough to share a place together, and the Duke retired to the main estate, while Grace huddled in the annex. This meant that the husband and wife had little or no contact, but if Benjamin was innocent of Grace's death, then what really happened? Now Grace didn't know what she could die from, and not knowing the cause turned out to be much more terrible than the evil husband who was supposed to kill her. Grace was sitting on the sofa, her arms wrapped around her shoulders, and at that moment the maid offered to light the fireplace if her mistress wished. Tormenting thoughts haunted the young heroine, and she suggested that perhaps Benjamin was not as vile as she had considered him all this time. Suddenly, the girl's stomach began to rumble loudly throughout the room, and the maid realized that her mistress urgently needed to eat well in order to gain strength. She laughed when she heard a funny sound coming from her mistress's stomach, and admitted that it was probably time to set the table. She also offered to bring food to the room, and if the mistress so desired, she could eat right in her bedroom. Grace thoughtfully asked the maid to prepare food, because she was really very hungry and had not eaten anything since her reincarnation. Left alone with herself, she carefully examined her hands and her body. I don't understand why the past Grace hated herself so much. Yes, she had small and plump hands, and to others they might seem fat, but everyone has different ideas about beauty. But looking at her hands, the heroine realized that they were much better than what she had in her past life. In her past life, the girl was very thin. When she had cardiac arrest, doctors were unable to save her. Back then, thoughts of death were all too familiar to her, and now she wondered if the real her had really died lying in a hospital bed. Suddenly, the heroine shuddered violently from the voice she had just heard in the room. She thought she might have misheard, but she was still sure of her sensations, and she definitely heard voices. Grace listened carefully, but heard nothing more, and her hands were still shaking. She clearly heard it. It was a mocking laugh that was harsh on her ears and seemed to be coming from all corners of the room. Just at that moment, the maid came and announced that she had brought food for the honorable lady, and it was time for dinner. She saw the lady standing thoughtfully near the window, and the lady seemed confused and frightened to her. The maid carefully placed the food on the table, admitting that she had decided to cook something light for her mistress. Grace thanked the maid for her concern, as she truly treated her with great respect. The maid could be called at any time if the mistress needed anything, and she was ready to happily carry out any order, leaving the mistress to have dinner. Taking a bite of the freshly baked, fragrant bread, Grace was surprised at how delicious the food was, how it melted in her mouth, and the chef must have done a great job. But she couldn't have a peaceful dinner, because when she looked out the window, she saw an unfamiliar carriage drive up to the creator. Looking closer, she realized it was a carriage from the main estate, and saw the silhouette of a young man getting into it. It was definitely the Duke, and he was clearly in a hurry, because the carriage quickly took off and drove off in an unknown direction. Seeing her husband leaving, the lady asked the maid if she knew where his lordship was going. The maid was silent, as if she knew where the master had gone, but for some reason she did not answer Grace's question. She asked if the maid was there only to watch over her mistress, and not to serve all the members of the family, and the frightened maid replied that this was not so at all. Grace asked for a quick answer to her question, because the maid knew exactly where the venerable gentleman was going to go. The heroine looked closely at her charge, wanting to know the whole truth, because she was clearly not telling her everything. And finally, after a long silence, Sally admitted that she actually knew where His Majesty had gone. She said that his lordship was going to serve on the Rondel Canal, and that was where he was going today with the knights. Grace wondered what could have caused such urgency, and there must have been some hidden clue. Suddenly, she realized that it was certainly there that the very saint whom Benjamin would have to love in the future was located. As it turns out, the entire temple is heading there today, as a major purification ceremony and service will take place there. And now there was no doubt that the saint would definitely be there, and this would be their first meeting with Benjamin. Grace, looking out the window, noticed her face and began to worry about her appearance. She was sure it must be hard to love a wife who looked like Grace, since she had always been convinced that she was fat and ugly. And unlike Arya, she has wavy hair, and exquisite clothes would look on her like a pearl necklace on a pig. And today, she really did wear pearls, and now she was laughing at herself and at her thoughts. All this time, the maid stood next to her mistress and noticed that she began to become very nervous. The maid admitted that the mistress looked completely unwell and asked if everything was okay with her. Grace smiled and replied that she was fine, but in reality, she was just too carried away and couldn't get those thoughts out of her head. His Majesty was well aware of Arya's appearance, and the author always praised her unearthly angelic beauty. Snow-white hair, golden eyes, shining and radiant, and flawless porcelain skin, on which there was not a single flaw. The Holy Lady was the complete opposite of Grace, and it was hard not to fall in love with such a perfect girl. It seemed that Benjamin had become infatuated with the beautiful Arya, and this was the current state of affairs, from which the heroine had nowhere to hide. She slammed her fists on the table and suddenly uttered the word exercise, and the maid standing next to her even flinched in surprise. The heroine understood that, frankly speaking, it was not a fact that she would become more attractive after losing weight, but this was her new life, and she had to try it. She finally had a body that could move freely, and the heroine did not want to live without experiencing it to the fullest, because for her it was great happiness. During the walk, she realized that her body was very weak, and she could not even run normally, let alone walk for a long time. And now Grace can at least walk, and for her this was a huge relief. So since this is how it turned out, the heroine decided to stick to a healthy lifestyle and increase her endurance by losing excess weight. She also planned to do something else, and for her goals, she was going to divorce Benjamin, who never really loved her. She wanted to get rid of this story and live alone, but judging by the fact that he rushed to meet Arya, their relationship had moved from dead center. And surely now the young man and the beautiful lady are having a nice date on the Rondel Canal, where he was so desperately rushing to today. Grace had no intention of standing in the way of their happiness, since Benjamin would never love her anyway, and the love story with the saint is at the heart of the novel. The lady decided to get a divorce as soon as possible and start a new happy life, so that Benjamin would no longer be around and she would not feel the lies that were hidden behind her back. In that case, he would no longer see her as an obstacle and would not try to kill her. But there is no evidence that it was Benjamin who killed Grace. But still, the heroine suspected only him. She wanted to increase her chances of survival, and she had to do everything, whether it was a divorce or playing sports. The heroine wanted to make an effort, but she didn't even know if anything would change, and she was in no way going to leave everything as it was. The maid felt that her mistress was clearly up to something, and asked if everything was all right with her. The lady replied that this time she was determined to make serious changes, and from now on, She would introduce diet and exercise to look better every day. The basis of the diet is a balanced diet and a healthy lifestyle, and Grace understood that this was absolutely essential for her now. To get in shape, she needs to do certain physical exercises and minimal actions that can lead to quick results. She wondered if Grace had any suitable clothes for sports, or if the lady only wore dresses that hid her figure flaws. The heroine asked the maid if there was any clothing that would fit tightly to the body, something that would be more comfortable to move in than a dress, and the maid looked at her with dumbfounded eyes. The maid's name was Sally, and she knew that her mistress had been against showing off her figure from the very beginning. Therefore, she could not help but be surprised by the sudden change in the mistress's behavior, and the mistress even asked to have a couple of things she had taken in. It was necessary to call a tailor for such work, and it would be better if it was a person whom the lady already knew. She wondered how she would be able to meet new people with a body like that, but that wasn't what she wanted to think about. The heroine felt that Grace hated herself terribly, but now the only thing that mattered to her was being able to move while she was completely healthy. Grace asked Sally to go look for a tailor, but she wanted to be alone with her thoughts and come up with a plan of action. The maid left her mistress's room and for a moment wondered if anyone was watching her, because she had the feeling that she was being watched. She scanned the room, making sure no one was watching from the other windows, and drew the curtains to be sure. It took her a long time after the migration to realize what was happening, but as soon as Grace opened her eyes, a huge flood of negative thoughts fell upon her, making it impossible to think, and there was an inexplicable feeling of helplessness inside. After spending several days in bed, she finally got used to this helplessness, and then realized that there was no hospital ceiling above her at all, and this place did not look like her ward. It took the heroine even longer to realize that she was in a fictional world, and once she got her bearings, it became clear to her what she needed to find. When her mind finally came to peace, she realized that she needed to find the main character's diaries, in which she could find answers. Grace's memories were too hazy, and now she didn't really go out anywhere to be discovered. But eventually, over time, the residents of the estate realized that she was not her mistress at all. Therefore, she needed to find the diary as soon as possible to learn the details of the past heroine's life. Grace scolded herself for having to look for the diary right away, instead of wallowing in depression. But all this was in vain. She couldn't find anything in Grace's room, and the derogatory thoughts that had taken over her mind continued to surface, and this drove the heroine who had moved into Grace's body crazy. The heroine promised to do everything in her power and asked Grace to hold on, because all her thoughts were a complete lie. She searched the entire room, but suddenly came across a ring in one of the drawers that clearly looked like an engagement ring. Taking the ring in her hands, she found it unsightly, because it didn't even contain a precious stone. But as soon as she thought about it, the heroine felt very strange, and everything seemed to start blurring before her eyes. It was unclear what was going on, but one thing became clear. Grace felt strange, and memories beyond that point did not return. At that moment, the maid knocked on the door, and the heroine didn't even immediately realize that her name was Sally. She realized it was the friendly blonde maid behind the door and said she could come in. Sally apologized for the intrusion, but every day at a certain time, she brought something to the lady. She brought health supplements, and it turned out that the lady takes medication every day. Grace didn't immediately understand what supplements were being discussed, but she began to play her part and laughed at how forgetful she had become lately. There were only 4 pills on the tray, and Sally said that the gentleman also knew that Grace was not taking them and was very worried about her. Now she needed to find out what kind of supplements she was taking, because Grace had no idea what kind of pills they were bringing her every day. She asked Sally if she knew what the supplements were, but the maid only knew that they were prescribed for health. It was all very strange and perhaps not to be trusted, and she didn't know exactly what kind of pills were on the tray. And it is quite possible that they are even trying to kill her. And this thought turned out to be the most frightening in the heroine's mind. The lady smiled and asked me to tell His Majesty that she apologized for making him worry and promised to take her pills in the future. Sally heard the new assignment and happily agreed to pass it on as soon as the gentleman returned. With each passing day, Grace's life became more and more mysterious and enigmatic, and she still had many more mysteries to unravel in order to understand what was really going on here. The only thing she knew was that Grace had died of some mysterious illness, and even after her death, no one could say what it was. She put the pills in the most secret drawer, and they seemed even more suspicious to her. It is quite possible that her husband was trying to eliminate her from the very beginning. And what is the point in finding out when the assassination attempts began? Because now there are more important things that she needs to take care of. The food at the estate was too delicious for Grace to overeat, so she decided to start by asking the cooks to cook only light food and cut down on the portions. She was served a salad for dinner, and it turned out to be quite tasty, but the heroine felt that it was not enough and that something was still missing. Grace needed to get used to this feeling if she wanted to lose weight quickly, but her thoughts were too confused now, and she could not get up from the dinner table yet. The maid noticed that the lady's complexion had become clearer in recent days, and Grace realized that drinking plenty of fluids really did help improve the condition of her skin. Grace knew from the beginning that drinking plenty of fluids was good for health, but Sally said she heard it from friends. The tailor was supposed to arrive before lunch today, but it was getting on for the middle of the day and he still hadn't arrived. She asked for tea, but the cookies were full of carbohydrates and could cause weight gain. But Grace didn't want the tailor to think she was being inhospitable. After all, among all the nobles, she was known as fat, lazy, and incompetent, but rumors about her inhospitality could not be allowed to spread. The heroine tried to understand where these rumors came from, whether someone could have maliciously spread them, because she was not such an ugly and lazy person. At the appointed time, the invited tailor arrived and greeted the Duchess with honor. He brought a clothing catalogue, as the lady had asked, and was ready to show her all the most current and fashionable models. Grace had no idea what was currently in fashion, and carefully looked through the catalogue with a variety of dresses. She settled on one of the outfits and said that she really liked that particular dress, but to her great surprise, the tailor declared that he did not want to seem rude, but the dress did not suit the Duchess at all. The heroine asked why he couldn't make this particular dress, since she really liked this model. The tailor replied that Countess Corfin had recently ordered the same dress, and if it were made for the Duchess, it might cause ridicule, and also the decorations were too extravagant, and would probably look too much on the Duchess. The tailor also said that freckles were also a serious drawback for such a lady, and Sally, standing behind, slowly began to get angry at the man's rude words. The lady replied that everything was fine, but she herself understood that this madman was trying to start a quarrel. A voice inside her told her that there was nothing she could do, but the new Grace was confident in herself and knew that she could argue with the tailor better than listen to that terrible voice in her head. She certainly wasn't going to tolerate the tailor's insolence, so she opened the catalogue again and declared that it was completely tasteless. The tailor asked again what the lady had just said, and the lady repeated once again that all the dresses were simply disgusting. The young man laughed and replied that it was probably because Grace was simply not familiar with this kind of outfit, and her taste in fashion had long since fallen behind. The lady asked for a point-by-point explanation of what exactly she didn't know, as she was determined to continue the dialogue with the man who had just been rude to her. The tailor insisted that the ladies spent most of their time in the outbuilding and that this year's fashionable designs were not at all suitable for her body type. Grace approached Sally, who was often in town, asking the maid for a small favor. The heroine realized that she had lost contact with the outside world while living in the outbuilding, so she needed the help of a maid because she wanted to order some comfortable clothes, but she was only offered a dress. In fact, this was part of Grace's plan, and stirring up rumors with the help of people around her could have great results in high society. The servants in the mansion got along well with each other, so they chatted with each other every day, and perhaps by that time, everyone already knew about the tailor's visit. Grace played her part beautifully, and with a trembling voice, admitted that she liked one dress, but the tailor offended her and said that it did not suit her figure. One of them started to mumble something, but an enraged Sally said menacingly that he was in the Duke of Felton's estate, and this was the mistress's house, so the tailor had no right to interrupt her. As a commoner, Sally might have found herself in a difficult situation, but in Grace's original story, she usually resolved such situations once or twice. She suggested finding another tailor and stated that she needed completely different things. The frightened tailor was sure that the Duchess could not do this to them, because he had been putting in so much effort all this time to sew clothes to fit her figure. These words sounded rather rude, and the tailor had just clearly hinted that the lady had a large build, and that such dresses required a lot of fabric. Grace smiled, finding this amusing, as she didn't care at all now, and the Duke was probably paying the tailor very generously for his work. Grace was no longer prepared to put up with incompetence, and the young man probably had nothing to say in his defense. So she wished the tailor well, telling him that he could go and that she no longer needed his services. After meeting with the tailor, the lady stood and thought about the situation that had happened, but she was sure that she had done everything correctly. Grace was a little worried whether everything had gone well or whether she had acted too harshly, but now she praised herself, because she had finally managed to pull herself together. The heroine was determined to strengthen her spirit, lose weight, get a divorce, and leave this house forever, having lived a long life. But due to Benjamin's invitation, her determination did not last long. The young man invited his wife for tea, and on the table there were various sweets, games with which she understood that because of all this, her weight could increase again, so she should refuse the treats. Benjamin was glad to oblige and bought some desserts, which are said to be popular at the moment. The mug contained coffee, which was also quite popular, and Benjamin wanted his wife to try the drink for the first time. Grace was incredibly happy that in this world they poured coffee for her, because even in the hospital she couldn't drink it, and she already knew in advance that this popular drink would be to her taste. Benjamin's happy smile meant that he was glad that his wife liked everything, and he was pleased to hear her praise. If the heroine hadn't read the original story, she would have definitely misunderstood everything, because Benjamin's smile said that he liked her. But it was all a blatant lie. At the table, Grace announced that she had to abstain from the sweet treats and delicious cakes that Benjamin had brought. As the young man slowly pushed a large piece of cake towards the girl's mug, he heard her words and couldn't believe his ears. Grace admitted that she is trying to lose weight, and recently, she decided to completely give up sweets, fatty, and heavy foods. She insisted that all this was just for her health, and that the situation with the tailor had nothing to do with it, and that she herself understood that she hardly seemed attractive with excess weight. Benjamin said that the tailor he recommended was exiled abroad, and his property was confiscated. It turned out that he had not only been evading taxes, but had been playing for the royal family, and it was an incredible relief to Benjamin that he had finally been caught. The young man promised to ensure that no one else would cast a shadow on his wife's reputation, and that all villains would be punished according to the law. So everything turned out the way Grace wanted, because she herself recently spoke about it. Looking at my husband and seeing his smile, which was as radiant as an angel's and completely captivating, the new tailor turned out to be strangely polite, and at the first meeting he couldn't even look the lady in the eye and was trembling nervously. The boy's face was incredibly pale, and Grace wondered if he needed to go to the hospital, because he looked so unwell. The tailors Benjamin invited were always very strange, and this young man was no exception. And is the Duke really so consumed by love for Arya that he chooses at random, completely oblivious to who comes to his wife? Sally happily announced that she had great news for the lady, and she would surely remember the recently expelled tailor. As expected, something clearly went wrong as events took a sharp turn, and Grace was the starting point for it all. As it turned out, the tailor was found dead at the border, and it turned out that he was even worse than they thought, and this man really deserved a worse punishment. The maid suggested celebrating the event, but the excited mistress had no idea that there was anything to celebrate here. Sally thought for a moment, before replying, that one could celebrate the fact that a person who didn't deserve to even breathe was no longer in this world and couldn't hurt anyone anymore. The Duchess looked at Sally with stunned eyes, and the maid realized that she had probably said something wrong. She asked the lady for forgiveness, because it was probably unpleasant for her to hear this, and Sally really hoped that she had not made the lady feel uncomfortable. Grace wondered if Sally thought she was a delicate hothouse flower, or if she was simply treated like a naive aristocrat who knew nothing about this world. But either way, she felt uncomfortable. The lady said that she wanted to go for a walk, so she was going to put on the clothes she had bought, and Sally needed to help her get ready. Finally, the lady acquired comfortable clothes, in which she had a completely different feeling. Her body was still heavy, but now it was much easier to move than before. She really liked the new outfits, and the lady felt absolutely great in them. After walking a few steps across the estate courtyard, she ran into the young man again. And it was too strange that on every walk she met Benjamin again and again. She asked if the gentleman had also decided to enjoy the sun, since the weather had been simply wonderful lately. Grace couldn't understand how the young man kept pretending that their daily meetings were accidental. But Benjamin, looking at the blooming garden, admitted that he was thinking about planting new peach tree seedlings in the garden. The heroine sighed when she heard about peaches, and Benjamin asked if his wife didn't like them. The lady admitted that she still liked them, and Benjamin's idea didn't seem so reckless. The lady would not mind trying a peach tart, and Benjamin was delighted, but she will have to abstain from the sweets since she is still on a diet. In this case, Benjamin thought for a moment and asked if his wife had any favorite flowers, because surely there was something she liked more than all the others. Grace couldn't say she knew much about flowers, and couldn't even remember any of their names, as she never intended to become a gardener. The young man admitted that he probably didn't take this nuance into account, and was thinking about how else he could surprise his wife. All this time, the maid Sally was watching the husband and wife, and she carefully watched how they talked and exchanged gestures. Since Grace and Benjamin were standing far apart, Sally guessed that there was a huge distance between them, and both were currently engaged in introspection. After some time, the lady finally began to experience external changes, and it did not matter whether Sally understood what was happening or not. Overjoyed, the lady asked the maid to look, because it had become much more comfortable for the girl to sit on, and indeed, she had managed to lose weight during this time. As expected, simple dietary adjustments helped a lot, as did giving up sweets and even short walks. Every day she went out for a walk, even when she didn't really feel like it. But when she looked out the window today, she didn't see Benjamin in the yard. Perhaps he simply didn't come out, and the previous meetings really could have been a coincidence. And thinking about this, Grace relaxed a little. In fact, today, she came out later than usual, and while walking through the garden, I noticed that next to each planted flower, there was a card with its name, which was not the case before. On their last walk, Benjamin admitted that he hadn't taken into account that Grace might not know the names of the plants. But now, walking through the blooming garden, she saw newly installed signs, and could not believe that her husband had done it. She suggested that perhaps the signs had been placed by the gardener, and the maid confirmed this, because the master himself had ordered the gardener to write the name. Was it because she said she didn't know the names of the flowers that the young man put up the signs? But it didn't look like ordinary kindness at all. An inner voice asked Grace to wake up, and sometimes she even felt scared by her thoughts. Looking at the signs, she didn't understand how to react, but she felt that there was a deception lurking somewhere around her. The lady suddenly began to shiver, and Sally assumed that the lady was probably cold and probably needed to go out for a walk earlier. Looking up at the sky, Grace felt a little sorry that she hadn't been able to see Benjamin, and had she really gotten used to his presence after all this time? Everything was going on as usual in the palace, and after a few days the maid became worried, because the mistress had recently seemed very thin. Grace assured me there was no need to worry, and it was probably because she had suddenly started dieting and leading a healthy lifestyle. Sally was worried that someone had said something offensive to the lady, and she kept wondering if something had happened the last time she had entered the office. The heroine just remembered the day when she was in the office, and it was a special place. I remember the original said that Grace used to hide in her office at the slightest provocation, and the real heroine was too ill to go outside. Grace had recently started to prefer walks, and now being in the room made her feel sad, and she was going to go to the office, asking Sally to bring some warm tea. The heroine was interested in Grace's diary, and it could probably be in the office, because there is a saying that if you want to hide a tree, hide it in the forest. The game's memory contained vague knowledge about this world, and some of her memories, but her thoughts were so foggy that it would have been better for the heroine not to remember anything at all, since it would have been easier to pretend that she had amnesia. She remembered very well how delighted Grace had been when she saw Benjamin at the wedding, because she valued this man very much. But now these memories were completely useless, and Grace tried her best to drive away the bad thoughts. Now she needed to focus her attention on the small office she had just entered. This place was definitely different from what she remembered, and the office looked completely different. She thought it would be a small office, but even the windows here were clean and well maintained. They overlooked the main building, and Grace didn't think it was the best view for her office windows. The maid had just brought tea for the mistress. Grace asked to leave it on the table, gazing out the window. The aroma of the hot drink spread throughout the entire office, and it was the very same flower tea that all the aristocrats were now talking about. Sally said that flower tea has become very popular lately, and they say that desserts with added flowers are now in fashion, and if the lady wishes, she can bring them. Grace refused and let Sally go, warning that she would remain in the office until about lunchtime. As soon as Sally left the office, the heroine immediately began searching for the diary, which she urgently needed to find, and she felt that this body clearly remembered three obvious places. The heroine clearly remembered the window, sofa, and table standing out against the general background, but the diary was nowhere to be found. She checked all the drawers and did not find this diary in any of them, although she was sure that it should be in one of the drawers. There was no way the diary wouldn't be there, and Grace was sure it was definitely in the office. The lady angrily hit the table with her fist and realized that it clearly contained some kind of internal mechanism that opened hidden drawers. To her great surprise, she actually slammed her fist on the table, and a secret drawer slid out, revealing a hard, leather-bound diary. Grace's diary, so elegantly hidden, contained the entries she began keeping immediately after her wedding. Opening the treasured diary, Grace noticed that the heroine wrote inconsistently, and her thoughts were fragmented. This strange diary looked more like a notebook, but it was still better than nothing. In her past life, Grace desperately wanted to have a child, but for various reasons she was torn between conflicts. One day she told Benjamin about this, that she would like them to have a child whom they would take care of and love like a real close-knit family. The young man did not take the news with joy at the time, and Grace immediately asked for forgiveness, promising never to speak about it again, because she was hurt by his hostile look. He certainly didn't want children from his wife, and yet he furnished his office to her taste, which was a contradiction in terms. The heroine didn't like all this very much, and at one point the diary fell out of her hands while she was looking around the office. The more memories Grace had of Benjamin, the more she felt that there was not a drop of love in his kindness. As often happens in reincarnation stories, she once wondered if her husband could truly love her, but it was all just an illusion. Grace's long-held feelings for Benjamin and her emotions from being transferred into someone else's body were intertwined into a chaotic tangle that was difficult to make out. And the fact that Benjamin never really loved his wife hurt her more and more every day. So after a while, Grace couldn't cope with the influx of feelings and emotions, and she began to spend every day in her bedroom again, burying her face in the pillow and not talking to anyone. Sally tried to somehow cheer up the lady and told her about the upcoming village festival, which the lady could probably attend. There was a masquerade ball with dressing up and masks coming up soon, and Sally was sure there would be something to see there. And even though the lady was on a diet, there would be plenty of delicious food. This news worked, and the mistress finally looked at the maids with tear-stained eyes. Sally was very worried that the lady had been eating almost nothing lately, and was sure that it was time for her to treat herself to something tasty that day. Grace didn't understand why Sally and Benjamin were so kind to her, or whether there was something selfish behind their kindness. She asked herself whether she should not allow herself to die in this kindness, to live for herself and die in such a way that no one would suspect anything. Suddenly, Sally couldn't hold back her tears and admitted that something was clearly wrong with the lady, and that she was hurt because she couldn't help her in any way. Grace replied that it was not like that at all, and that Sally was very helpful, but the lady was just mentally tired and so immersed in her thoughts that she did not notice anything around her. The heroine understood that she would hardly be able to hold out for long without food, so she suggested that Sally eat everything. In an excited voice, Sally promised to bring soup, because everyone understood that the lady urgently needed to eat. Every day the cook cooked fresh soup for the lady and kept it ready, and everyone tried their best for Grace. The maids admitted that they did not want their mistress to apologize so often, and it was time to stop asking for forgiveness, because everyone knew very well what a kind heart Grace had. They suggested taking a hot bath to relax first, and then trying some delicious hot soup. After some time, Grace finally got out of bed, took a bath, ate her soup, which meant that the servant's mission to rescue the mistress was successfully completed. While rereading Grace's diary, the heroine finally noticed something strange, and it caught her attention. From some of the lines, she realized that someone had suggested that Grace keep a diary, and that it was as if they had spoken to her about it, telling her to keep records without fail. She also found strange markings in the diary that stopped when she moved into this case, which was another mystery. This meant that Grace did something regularly, but for some reason the heroine did not remember anything at all, and it seems that the love fantasy is slowly turning into mysticism. Her memories were scattered due to the transfer to a new body, but now she felt like she was releasing something important. And just at that moment, a sudden thud from a flying stone was heard outside the window. Grace didn't immediately understand what was happening, but she decided to go to the window and see where the stone came from. Looking out the window, she couldn't believe that at such a late hour someone dared to throw stones at the Duchess's windows. But below she saw Benjamin, who stood with a satisfied smile and greeted his mistress. Taken aback, the lady moved away from the window as if she wanted to hide, but she had already met Benjamin's gaze, and he was smiling as if he was demanding attention. She decided that nothing terrible would happen if she gave the young man a minute, so she asked if something had happened. The young man admitted that it was very nice that the Duchess was still awake, and a slight red blush appeared on his cheeks. Looking at the flushed young man, Grace asked him what he would do if she were asleep, since she could convey her words through the butler. He admitted that he was not allowed to enter Perestroika, which is precisely why there was a small stone thrown at the window. He threw small stones so that the sound was barely audible, and if Grace had been awake, she would have clearly heard it, and if not, she would have continued to sleep peacefully. Benjamin apologized, but it was just an excuse, and in reality, he was just desperate because Grace hadn't gone out for her morning walks for a long time. The heroine had indeed not left her room for a long time due to her bad mood, but this was the first time she had heard that Benjamin was not allowed to enter the annex. At the moment, the extension was closed to outsiders, and no one could enter it without the Duchess's permission. Grace didn't immediately understand what this could mean, because this was the first time she had heard about a ban on visiting the annex. She was even surprised that she had personally forbidden the Duke to come here, and now she hoped to find out all the details. It was rather strange why Grace had forbidden Benjamin from visiting the annex, but the young man did not seem upset about it at all. Now the heroine couldn't understand, because Benjamin was so attentive to the bite, but for some reason she forbade him to appear here. And yet, now it remained to be seen why Benjamin was looking for his wife at such a late hour. The young man admitted that he was so happy to see his wife after a long time that he forgot himself for a moment and just wanted to see her. According to him, a significant festival was soon to take place, which all residents celebrated with pleasure. So if Grace was feeling well and had some free time, the young man suggested that they go together and have some fun at the holiday festival. The Mask Festival was a holiday where anyone could have fun in peace, soon discovering their identity behind any mask. Grace didn't remember Benjamin talking about the festival in the original story, and it certainly wasn't part of the novel's plot. But that late night, the Duke himself came to her to ask if she would like to go with him to the festival. Grace became very upset at this proposal, and Benjamin, noticing his wife's condition, shouted for a doctor to be called immediately. She agreed to go to the masquerade together, and at that moment her face flushed fiery red with embarrassment. After these words, the heroine immediately closed the window and drew the curtains until Benjamin saw how excited she was. For some time, he stood silently at her window, watching with his mouth open to see if his wife would appear again. It was already late at night outside, and the Duke's assistant, the butler, was standing next to him. He immediately noticed that Benjamin looked very happy, and he hadn't seen the gentleman in such a good mood for a long time. For the first time, Benjamin's wife took the time to talk to him, and he decided he had to spend 24 hours with her. But everyone understood perfectly well that the festival did not last that long, and the butler was not at all sure that she would agree to spend so much time with him. Grace lay in her cozy bed and couldn't believe that she would soon be going to the mask festival, because she hadn't been out in public for a long time. She clearly remembered that in the original, Grace rejected her husband, and the Duke was definitely not with his wife at the mask festival. That day, Benjamin went to the festival alone, and then tried to charm Arya with his puppy face and silly behavior. And it was all just Grace's imagination. Benjamin had prepared a gift for Grace, who was left at home, but he also prepared a separate present for Arya, who had helped him choose a gift for Grace, and then he pretended to give the gift as a friendly thank you. The heroine didn't know if going to the festival with her husband would change the course of history, but she was more upset by the fact that the young man would go with his plump wife. Bad rumors would immediately spread among the nobles, which would eventually reach the royal family, and Grace really didn't want that. From the outside, it will look like everything is going just fine in the marriage arranged by the royal family, but she was afraid that it would all end with Benjamin going crazy over Arya and causing a scandal by kidnapping her. And even though he was her husband, he was still a man mad with love. The morning rays of the sun were streaming through the window, and the heroine woke up in a great mood, feeling fresh and rested. She decided to resume her walks again, but noticed that the maid, Sally, looked busy. Sally said that all the maids were busy preparing for the festival, because the mistress had to look simply charming. Grace knew it had been a busy night, and Benjamin had come to see her, but she hadn't expected the news of going to the festival together to spread so quickly. She held a robe in her hands and suggested that the lady wear it to the festival, but the girl found it too thick. The robe was unusual, as it was made from the fur of a magical beast, and it is said to have the property of absorbing heat, and the fabric keeps cool during the day and does not let in cold air at night. The robe was made from the fur of a magical beast called Leighton, and was indeed very comfortable. Hearing this word, Grace realized that she had definitely encountered it in the original, and looking at the robe, she immediately understood what kind of fabric was being discussed. A green gold brooch with large emeralds adorned the mantle, and the girls looked at the new garment with pleasure. Sally was worried that the lady might not like her, but Grace assured her that everything was fine. This robe was already familiar, and after Grace's death, when the Duke kidnapped the lady, he threw the robe over the girl's shoulders and said that it suited her very well. Benjamin was an enigmatic and mysterious figure, and Grace could never fully trust him. Although the young man's smile seemed warm, the feeling emanating from it was always eerie, and the heroine did not understand why the thing intended for Arya was now in her hands. She asked the maid again if it was true that she could wear the robe, and assured her with salt that the fur for the robe had been specially obtained for the mistress. Grace was surprised that the fur was really harvested and not bought in a special shop. But everyone understood that this fur had indeed been simply purchased, and Sally admitted that she had misspoke by pure accident. Claiming that the fur had been obtained by accident, Sally tried to block the window, but the lady noticed this and found it suspicious, wondering if Benjamin had told her to say so. Sally just smiled and didn't say anything else, because she felt she had said something unnecessary, and since she remained silent, it meant that it was indeed true. And after that, Grace asked the maid to move away from the window for a second. Grace slowly walked to the window and looked at what was happening below, what Sally was trying so hard to hide. Looking out the window, the lady was surprised by what she saw and wanted to know what was going on there. Below sat 3 knights, trying not to catch the master's eye, because they had just returned from a difficult campaign and really wanted to rest. Seeing the tired knights, the lady realized that the truth was being hidden from her again, and something was definitely going on here. Turning to the maid, she asked menacingly if the fur was really an accident, but Sally only trembled and remained silent. She began to say that the lady was too fragile, and the festival was long, and there would be a lot of people there. She called it a fateful coincidence, and several months of searching were not in vain, and it so happened that the magical beast was found and captured. The hunting season had not yet begun, so they sent out a search party, and since the beast can only be encountered once a year, luck smiled on the knights, and within a few months they caught the beast. The heroine asked the maid not to say another word, and she heard what she wanted, but now she did not know what to do. She felt awkward, because the robe was indeed made especially for her. But there was also a second option. It was given to Arya, but she refused. The lady tried to calm herself down, deciding that everything was fine, and she would just put on the robe, and the maid thought it was a wonderful idea. Now Grace knew that the knights had specially obtained wool for her, and she wanted to give them a gift and asked what she could give them. Sally was sure that the knights would simply be glad to see the lady on a date with the master in this robe, and she had better change and get ready to go out. The master was already waiting for the girl downstairs, and the delighted maid asked the mistress not to worry about anything. Grace had been given a selection of formal dresses, so she had to choose the one she liked. As soon as the heroine put on the dress, she saw how loose it was, but there was absolutely no time to alter the garment. Grace put on her robe and decided to leave like that, and Sally wished her a safe journey. Grace put on a carnival mask and robe, and finally came out to Mr. Benjamin to go to the festival together. The gentleman looked charming in an elegant dark brown suit, and he eagerly awaited the appearance of his mistress. The heroine became worried, wondering if she had arrived late, but the young man reassured her, as he had come early specifically to meet his wife. He elegantly extended his white-gloved hand, declaring that ladies were never late. In an instant, the heroine calmed down and realized that there was absolutely no point in worrying, because they were going to have fun and enjoy themselves. In the original, Benjamin and Arya had an exciting date at this festival, and the knowledge that the robe was supposed to be a gift for Arya no longer bothered the heroine, but rather upset her. Benjamin warned that they would call each other differently in public while they were on the street. Grace asked what they should call each other, since she hadn't been out in public for a long time. Benjamin suggested calling him just Darling or Benny, so as not to give their real names. Grace smiled when she heard that the young man wanted her to call him Darling, and it was very unexpected for her. She admitted that she would be happy to call him Benny, and asked him to call herself simply Milady. The young man was happy, and Grace really hoped that they would have a wonderful time together. Benjamin was indeed a very strange young man, and Grace considered him a real eccentric. The mask festival was held at the temple, and it was the first festival Grace agreed to attend, as she preferred to stay at home and never liked the festival in her hometown. The festival was a city tradition, and the reason for wearing carnival costumes was rooted in a legend that a mischievous demon lurked among those who came to the festival, stealing those who caught his eye. Grace had heard about this legend, and her father often told her and her sister this tale when they were children. Benjamin assumed that Grace had a pretty good relationship with her sister, but the lady spoke little about her family, but always spoke about the good things. Lost in thought, the heroine did not remember anything, and the memories of her sister seemed to have been erased. And this was quite natural, because only fragments of memories of the past, Grace, were available to her, and these were only a few moments from her life. Benjamin offered the girl his hand, and the lady looked at her husband with frightened eyes. His behavior was too friendly, but Grace knew very well how the husband actually treated his wife in the original. He took her hand firmly, and Grace felt that she should be next to her husband now. He said that they should stay as close as possible, since the lady had not been in the company of people for a long time. Benjamin wondered if it wouldn't be better for them to just hold hands rather than walk arm in arm, and he took the girl's fragile hand even more tightly. The young man heard that the lady still limits herself in food, but today he suggested that she treat herself to something delicious. Grace admitted that she had actually thought about it, but since she really wanted to lose weight, she had been limiting herself in many foods. But today, she decided to remove all restrictions and just relax. It was truly impossible to resist the stalls with all sorts of delicacies, so the lady allowed herself to be pampered a little. Benjamin thought this was an excellent solution and suggested that the lady wait while he bought something tasty. The young man asked his wife to be careful with strangers, and Grace promised that she would definitely follow his words. She noticed that Benjamin looked worried, but she knew that he was the most dangerous person here. The heroine's attention was drawn to the children at the festival, and turning in their direction, she felt that it was time to approach them. Seeing 3 children sitting on the road, who were at the festival without any adults, the lady approached the boys and asked what they were selling here, and their goods were lying in front of the little street vendors. One of the girls said they were selling soap that they made with their own hands. The children asked if the lady really wanted to buy their scented soap, since she was the first one to approach them. Grace hadn't thought about buying soap, but she decided to see what kind of product the kids were selling. On the iron plates lay square pieces of gray soap, which looked not at all attractive. This soap was ordinary, the shape, the color, and the smell, Everything was simple, so the heroine wondered whether it was worth buying. But she really wanted to help the poor children, and they probably really needed money. The heroine asked where the children's guardian was, but it turned out that only the teacher had come with them, which meant that these children were orphans without parents. The lady wondered why children were forced to do such work, and whether these little ones were simply being exploited. At that moment, a young lady approached them and asked if a customer had approached the guys. She assumed the girl was the orphanage's caretaker, but this lady had a different role. The lady was an ordinary teacher who probably cared about poor orphans and tried to help them somehow. Grace was afraid that teachers at the local orphanages might be pocketing donations, so she decided to find out the whole truth. The highest position in the orphanage was occupied by the director, and the lady thought with horror that this man could certainly take money from the orphans. The lady didn't know how to help these children, because if she just bought all the soap, it would be a short-term solution. She came up with an idea and could sponsor these children as a duchess, because the children hardly had a chance to become independent and do without sponsors. Grace felt a strong desire to help innocent children, and this must be the obsessive nature of the previous heroine, so she turned to the teacher and asked her name. The lady finally decided to be polite and introduce herself, and gave her real name, believing that it would be more correct. The young teacher's name was Cleta Dunn, and she was very sweet and friendly. Smiling, the heroine admitted that she was very glad to meet him and was going to propose an interesting idea to the teacher. She offered to help sell all the soap, since everyone understood perfectly well that the guys had very little chance. Cleta smiled broadly and couldn't believe that she had received such a great offer from an unknown person. The lady was determined to help these children, so she bought soap-making tools and packaging, as well as some sweets for the children. Benjamin carefully distributed candy to the orphans, and each child was incredibly happy with the little pleasant surprise. Grace asked her husband to watch the children, while she and her teacher set out to make the most incredible soap. She bought some herbs and pressed flowers for soap making, and this soap was supposed to be very fragrant and beautiful. Floating flowers have been all the rage lately, so the lady decided to try adding them to soap. She wanted to create a soap that would have aesthetic beauty, and it seems Grace has succeeded. The soap turned out absolutely incredible, and the teacher even thought that Grace was well versed in this simple hobby. Finally, the flies finished their soap making, and in front of them lay beautifully packaged pieces of soap with flowers inside. Cleta looked at the soap they had made and realized that it looked very expensive, so they could even ask for a higher price for it. They agreed on the price per piece and decided to sell each piece of soap for 900 zen. For the teacher, this price seemed too high, but Grace assured that for such a beautiful soap, the price was quite reasonable. Grace smiled and declared that all the soap would definitely sell out, and Cleta would soon see for herself. The finished soap was laid out for sale, and people passing by immediately smelled the fresh, pleasant aroma. To attract customers, Grace used a clever trick. She used the remaining soap solution to create large soap bubbles, from which this incredible smell emanated. The soap bubbles brought incredible delight to the people and children passing by, and for them, it was like a magical fairy tale. The children loved blowing bubbles, and it seemed they had never been so happy in their lives. Even the teacher noticed that the children really enjoyed this activity, and the soap bubbles brought them complete delight. She was incredibly happy that today they met an amazing girl, Grace, who helped create beautiful soap and sell it at a high price. The first customers had already approached them, asking what that wonderful aroma was and what the ladies were selling. Everyone who came up to it called the soap incredibly beautiful, and the ladies worked tirelessly to make it in time for the festival. Grace also decided to come up with a legend that was supposedly passed down by word of mouth in the town, and it went like this: if you use the flower soap you bought on the day of the festival, your wish will definitely come true. Cleta, with a happy face, told customers an interesting legend, which made them even more eager to buy the scented soap. People at the festival, hearing this legend, considered it incredibly romantic, and every suitable person actually bought one piece of soap. The legend about the soap that makes wishes come true spread quickly, so after a while, a crowd of buyers had gathered around the girls. The mask festival was drawing to an end, and the number of city residents on the streets was decreasing, but fortunately, all the soap was sold out. It was only towards evening that Grace realized how tired she was and how much work she had done today. Teacher Cleet looked so exhausted that Grace had no choice but to help with the soap sales. Together, they sold all the soap, and the heroine was very happy, but for some reason, she suddenly felt just awful. For some unknown reason, Grace began to feel very nauseous, and her chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. A minute ago, everything had been fine. She assumed that she had simply imagined it, and perhaps she had not noticed the nausea before, because she had been very busy and distracted by something else. But now the heroine felt somehow empty inside. Suddenly, she collided with a passing man. Her mask fell off, and Grace felt defenseless. The man laughed and said that he felt like he had tripped over a heavy statue and asked how a woman could fall with such a crash. Grace knew he was referring to her full figure, but she didn't even want to turn around and look at the offender. He laughed and continued to insult the girl, saying that she was too fat, and it was no wonder that she couldn't dodge and ended up running into someone. Sitting on the stone road, the lady heard nasty ridicule about her body and appearance. The man continued to mock her, and the frightened girl only asked for one of the passers-by to help her, because hearing the insults was unbearable. The punishment immediately caught up with the offender, and at that very second, a huge suitcase flew at him, instantly knocking him off his feet. It was Benjamin, who declared that he was in a good mood today, and the man had better not spoil it if he wanted to leave here on his own 2 feet. Indeed, her husband Benjamin was nearby. He slowly took off his hat and put it on his wife's head, since her mask had fallen somewhere. The heroine was still sitting on the road, and from the unpleasant sensations and unbearable fear, she seemed unable to move. Benjamin walked up to his wife and asked her to listen carefully, because he had just seen with his own eyes how a stranger called her names. He hugged Grace carefully and gently said that they needed to go home, and if she had difficulty walking, he would be happy to pick her up and carry her. Grace felt safe when she heard Benjamin's voice, and the voice wasn't full of anger, it was kind and loving. The next morning, when she woke up, the lady felt that she had completely fallen apart and did not have the strength to pull herself together. She couldn't get that alley out of her head, and maybe being alone only made her sink deeper into bad thoughts. But the festival was so nice. The heroine felt like she wanted to go to a shelter, but at the same time, she didn't want to leave her room. But she understood that she needed to do something to feel better. Sally stood outside the door and waited for the lady to wake up. Noticing that she was completely at a loss, Grace asked the maid to bring the ledger so she could finally start sorting out her expenses. The girl didn't look well at all, but she decided to keep herself busy and needed to feel better. All the entries in the ledger were well organized, but Grace noticed that gold jewelry was being purchased too frequently. 2 years had already passed since the wedding, and this thought made the girl think for a while. She was sure that only a year had passed since the wedding day, and she mentioned this when talking to Benjamin. But now, remembering their last dialogue, she assured her husband that only a year had passed since the wedding, and it became clear that the heroine had made a huge mistake. Benjamin probably didn't notice these words, but Grace tried so hard to be careful. But now she couldn't allow herself to fall into further melancholy. She really wanted to help the orphanage and decided to start a tea business, making it more accessible to ordinary people. Therefore, the heroine decided to buy land so she could quietly run the orphanage and help the children. The heroine thought that it would be nice to acquire some land, and the closer the better, deciding to choose the best location herself. Having informed Sally about the land purchase, Grace was determined to see it through, and the maid promised to make all the arrangements. Today was probably an unusual day, and his lordship sent his wife a gift, which was reported to her by the maid. That evening at the festival, Benjamin stood up for his wife, and Grace was unaccustomed to seeing the young man angry. She tried to push away bad thoughts, remembering the unexpected gift that was probably supposed to be delivered to her soon. Sally smiled and assured that this gift was incredibly beautiful, and the lady would definitely like it. The unexpected gift helped the girl switch to positive thoughts, and she even felt the desire to look at it. Together with the maid, the mistress went to look at the gift and finally get distracted from bad thoughts. At the end of the corridor, the girl saw incredibly beautiful flowers standing in vases, and this was the very gift from Benjamin. The vases were filled with small flowers of incredibly beautiful colors, and Grace immediately realized that these flowers would be perfect for a herbarium, and Benjamin's gift was truly beautiful. But that was not all, and Sally held something else in her hands, asking the lady what to do with it. The incredibly beautiful box contained what looked like delicious cookies, and Benjamin even sent a few. Grace thought about the orphanage, which was located nearby, and suggested that Sally take cookies to the orphans. Next to the box of cookies stood a herbal tea in a beautiful package, which was also a nice gift from the gentleman. Having looked at all the gifts, the lady asked the maid to find some unnecessary muslin so that she could try to make something. Sally promised to look, and the lady admitted that she had one more small request. She wanted to ask for one more favor, and holding a jar of herbal tea in her hands, she looked at the maid with embarrassment. The lady admitted that she was going to use her personal funds at her own discretion, and this was her personal right, and she also warned that she would only be going out into the city for a short time. Although Benjamin's answer was a little unexpected, no one objected to her new conditions. The young man asked if something were to happen, it would probably be difficult for Grace to cope alone, suggesting that someone follow her at a distance for her own safety. After listening to her husband's opinion, Grace initially decided that Benjamin had decided to act thoughtfully. She assured that everything would be in perfect order, thanking her husband for his attention and response to her request. Grace went out into the street, confident that it would be quiet and less crowded than during the festival, because she really wanted to help Cleet, and after the divorce, her reputation in society could play an important role. She went to the teacher to tell her about her new business idea that could help their orphanage. The heroine brought a small tea bag that she made herself from muslin. Grace wanted to import food products and allow people to try a variety of teas. She knew that tea was not in great demand among commoners, and this was all due to the accompanying problems. Enjoying a cup of tea requires a lot of time and effort, and requires the use of a brewing device, and few ordinary people can enjoy the drink without any problems. According to the heroine, this was the main problem, and you can simply pour hot water over the tea bag and enjoy the aromatic drink. Cleta admitted that it was nice to have such easy access to such luxury, but would they be able to implement this wonderful idea? She insisted that they didn't have a store, and ingredients would be hard to come by, and given the situation at the shelter, hiring help would be difficult. But the lady had already thought everything through in advance and assured that there would be no problems and that everything had been decided long ago. Cleta didn't quite understand what was being discussed, but the lady's idea interested her incredibly. Grace said she had already selected one tea plantation and the shelter would become the store, and tea sales should begin from there. She had already made up her mind about assistants, suggesting that they hire the mothers of these children. The teacher was surprised to hear that the lady somehow knew that orphanage children had mothers, because usually children who live in orphanages do not have parents. It didn't take Grace much effort to figure it all out. When she saw those children at the festival for the first time, she immediately realized that these children were not orphans. It was all obvious, as the children were too clean and well-groomed to have only one guardian, who was their teacher. She asked if these children knew about their mothers, because every child should have a parent. Grace was not a stupid girl at all, and Cleta immediately noticed that the lady had a high intellect. She wanted the children to see their parents at least once, because everyone wants to be close to their beloved family. Cleta immediately accepted Grace's offer, which meant the shelter was in dire need of money at the moment. And surely some mothers give money for their children, but they will not be able to continue to see their children in any shelter. Probably something made them do this, and the girls had their reasons. But now the lady would like to talk about the director of the shelter, who is responsible for everything. Cleta said that the shelter's director ran away as soon as he realized that the shelter would not be profitable, and after collecting all the money, he immediately left the place. Grace was grateful that the lady told the whole truth, and she promised to hire mothers. She suggested converting the empty space into a soap-making work area and using the spare bedrooms to house the workers. Cleta had never thought about this before, and she thought the lady's idea was simply excellent because it would reduce costs and mothers could safely remain close to their children. And besides, raw materials, black tea, will be supplied reliably from the plantation that the lady mentioned earlier. Now the land that the heroine chose was not very good, but soon Saint Aria should appear, visit it, and bless the land. and for the next few years, the tea leaves from this land will be of the highest quality. Grace asked to find out about the matter, although they were working in the orphanage, and the teacher promised to take care of it right away. There are 13 children living in the shelter, 7 of whom have mothers, and so far only one of them has accepted the job offer, and Grace didn't understand why the ladies were refusing. She was sure that everything would be the other way around, and the girls would happily agree. But if they didn't find workers, all their efforts would be simply pointless. It was unacceptable that a case started to build a reputation would end up depriving the mothers of their livelihood, and Grace couldn't figure out what to do next to keep Benjamin from finding out. This idea was probably a failure, but the heroine had an interesting idea and wanted to meet the children's mothers in person and give them a gift. I didn't understand what they were talking about or who exactly Grace wanted to meet, but the lady looked quite inspired. She even wanted to make something with her own hands and give it to the girls so that they would feel that they were treated with more respect. Grace was so excited about the idea that she even decided to write a letter and decorate the paper with the pressed flowers Benjamin had given her. But the maid still couldn't figure out who the mistress was planning to give something to, and the question was on the tip of Sally's tongue, but she didn't dare ask it. After all, it was the first time she had seen the lady so lively and joyful, and she promised to prepare everything soon, because she trusted her completely. In one of the palaces, a young man sat in a leather chair, pondering important issues. Catherine's days were grueling, with her working in the kitchen all day, leaving late at night, and returning home only in the early morning. This girl couldn't give up because it wasn't easy for her to get this job, so she tried her best. Next month, it will be a year since Catherine started this job, and she was really looking forward to buying her child a birthday present. Returning home late one day, tired and exhausted, she saw a parcel with a letter near her door. Catherine thought it was some noblewoman's joke and had no intention of joining some hastily cobbled-together interest group. She even wanted to throw the letter away at first, but she smelled a pleasant aroma from it and decided that it still needed to be read. The letter was about Catherine's baby, and Grace wanted to share the good news that Ash had successfully solved multiplication problems for the first time, asking for praise when they met. The letter made no mention of business, but was about Catherine's child, who was delighted with every rare meeting with his mother. As the lady read the letter, tears appeared in her eyes, and these kind and gentle words were enough for her. After reading the message, Catherine thought that it was written by a very strange person, but this letter was not the only one. Letters like these, full of warmth and kindness, kept coming, and eventually they convinced the mothers to agree. It took one lady a whole month, but she eventually agreed, and because of the games, she was sure that this was only the beginning. It seemed that Cleta was also happy that she met the virtuous lady who had helped the shelter so much. Life at the shelter changed in an instant, and the lady wanted to return to the shelter as soon as possible to start work. But not only had life at the shelter changed, but Mrs. Grace's life was also radically different from what it had been before. Work made her happy, and when everything went well for the lady, she did not feel depressed, as if she had found her value. On her way back from the orphanage, Grace suddenly saw Saint Aria on the street, but she was not standing there alone. Benjamin stood next to her, and seeing the two of them together for the first time, Grace couldn't believe her eyes. It really was that same saintly Aria Miller, a girl of incredible beauty with amber, sincere eyes. A few hours before Grace saw Benjamin and Aria, the lady was still at the shelter. The women here turned out to be so kind, and the more time the lady spent in the shelter, the lighter her soul became. It was a special day for everyone, because the children's mothers had finally arrived at work, and everyone was ready to greet them with respect. Grace suggested to the teacher that they go to the textile workshop to discuss cooperation, so the girls went to resolve the issue. The lady intended to take advantage of the conditions of a large workshop that makes deals with clothing stores, leaving small shops with unrealized opportunities. And the lady was determined not to limit herself to just a small amount, because she was going to earn a large sum, so she hired employees. The lady decided to supply the first batch of tea bags free of charge to several establishments in the capital, but the teacher was afraid that the business would start with losses. Since people are not familiar with this type of tea, they cannot buy it right away, and the lady suggested making some kind of advertisement. She was sure that at least one place would respond positively, especially now that plain water in the capital is difficult to drink. Pollution was spreading in the western lands, and even after cleaning the canal, the water had a strange taste. To solve this problem, Arya went on an expedition to the west, which was written about in the later episodes of the original story. Grace was sure that nothing would happen if she used it just once for her own purposes. Cleta didn't even expect that so many carts with water would arrive. But that wasn't all. The lady was certain that once the number of establishments using tea bags exceeded 5, business would become overwhelming. And to meet demand, hard work had to begin now. She planned to go to the workshop and asked one of the girls to accompany her. And it was desirable that the lady had basic knowledge of textile workshops. One of her girls immediately volunteered, and it was the mother of a girl named Lily. They entered the first textile workshop, where the man showed them the fabric that was available. After carefully examining the canvas, the girls decided to go to the second workshop, where they also familiarized themselves with the assortment. They soon found the necessary canvas, and everything was finished even faster than the ladies expected, and Grace was incredibly happy. Mother Lily admitted that she thought there would be more resistance, and expected to hear that business was not a woman's business at all. Grace wasn't going to deny her words, but one thing was clear: things were going very well for them. She asked why Grace had chosen the smallest, run-down workshop when the second one was the nicest to look at. The lady would be embarrassed to say that it was all because of her expensive robe made of the fur of a magical beast. Most people won't realize that it's made from valuable fur, but the workshop owners, being experts, will have no problem determining the value of this item. But only in the last workshop did the man recognize the material and realize that this was no ordinary commoner standing before him. Grace didn't go into detail, asking if Lily's mother knew that the fabric was called muslin. And only in the last workshop they make it thin and of excellent quality, and Grace needed high-quality material, so she decided to collaborate with that workshop. Thinking about the workshop, Grace felt a sense of satisfaction that everything was beginning to fall into place. Grace was walking in a great mood on her way out of the workshop, and it was at that moment that a strange event awaited her. She witnessed this scene where her husband Benjamin was smiling at the blonde girl. They were standing right in the center of town, having a nice conversation, but Grace never expected to see her husband next to Arya Miller so soon. Arya was the main character of the novel, the desire of a saint and the darling of this world, and she was truly beautiful. When Grace first saw the charming Arya, she felt that this girl was completely different from her. Benjamin failed to escape his wife's eyes, and the next second he noticed a familiar silhouette in a robe passing by. He realized that his wife had just passed right next to him and saw him standing with another girl. Grace pretended not to see her husband, but he immediately turned to my lady passing next to him. The young man immediately followed his wife and asked where my lady was heading, but Grace pretended not to hear anything. Benjamin turned and saw that she had a lot of things, deciding to offer his help. The lady replied in a serious tone that Benjamin already had a companion and that she could handle the things herself. The young man insisted that none of this mattered, but Grace wasn't so sure, as the one and only Holy Empire clearly held great significance for the young man. Benjamin didn't expect that kind and modest Grace would be able to answer him like that, and he looked after her in bewilderment. The lady replied that although she had locked herself in her room, everything was now known, and Benjamin should not have deceived her. Seeing the situation that was incomprehensible to her, Arya stood aside, completely unable to understand what was going on here. Her gaze was dark and sad, but the lady was not at all to blame for the fact that Benjamin turned out to be a lying deceiver. Grace and the worker finally made it to the shelter, and Mother Lily never asked anything when they met. She must have been very curious to know what happened, but this girl turned out to be very tactful. And although she was not at all from their circle of people, the girls quickly became close while working. After meeting Benjamin, Grace felt uneasy and had to suppress her out-of-control emotions while working. Together with the children's mothers, they finally got down to important work, and each of them was passionate about the new endeavor. After meeting Benjamin, Grace decided she needed a divorce quickly, and she was too scared to hear about her husband's true feelings for this girl. After a hard day at work, the lady lay down on her bed, exhausted, and it felt like cats were scratching at her soul. She didn't want to eat anything, and she felt absolutely disgusting, and she probably should have admitted that she had changed after reading the diary, and now she had completely become Grace Felton. Having established important work processes, the lady informed Cleet that she would probably not be able to devote much time to their business. Cleta didn't expect to hear this, since it was the brainchild of the mistress, but she was sure that the teacher could now handle it herself. Cleta turned out to be a determined and good person, so Mrs. Oni was worried about the work of the shelter, and now her main task was a divorce from Benjamin. She was going to meet the gentleman and asked Sally where his lordship was. Benjamin was supposed to be resting in the main building, and since he was not busy, the lady decided to talk to him. It might be a bit hasty, but she had wanted this from the start, and she knew it was best to take action while she still had the courage. The lady wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible, before she became melancholy again, and she was wondering how best to start the conversation. They met Benjamin in the gazebo in the flower garden, and Grace was preparing to begin an important conversation. Her face expressed decisive confidence, and finally, the lady admitted that she needed to tell Benjamin something. The young man was happy to listen to her words and asked her to speak freely, as her heart required. Today, Mrs. Benjamin's smile disgusted her, and although it turned out to be sweet, it did not touch her at all. She didn't want to die at the hands of her husband, because of a one-sided love that was not destined to be mutual, and in the end, he would still like Arya. A girl like Grace probably wouldn't even get a glance from Benjamin, but she really wanted it to be over. The heroine did not want to accept death as an answer to unrequited love, so she immediately said that she and Benjamin would have to divorce. Benjamin clearly wasn't expecting to hear the news of the divorce, and looked at his wife with concern. It was unbearable to see his face, and Grace admitted that in the end, they only got married for the sake of their families. She promised not to talk about anything else, and not to catch the gentleman's eye for the rest of her life. But suddenly, Benjamin began to cry, and asked why my lady was saying such offensive words. Seeing the young man's reaction, Grace was surprised, and he asked in a trembling voice if he had made some kind of mistake. With tears in his eyes, he looked at his wife and assured her that if she wanted something, he would definitely do everything for her. He cried and was ready to kneel, even at the suggestion that his wife did not like his appearance. The Duke continued to cry and even promised to wear a mask for the rest of his life, begging Grace not to get divorced. He begged her not to leave, kneeling, and it was the first time Grace had seen her husband in such a state. She considered his words rather strange, since she had recently seen him with another girl. And was Mr. Benjamin not in love with Arya at all, because he was now begging his wife not to leave him? Benjamin admitted he had many shortcomings, blaming himself for the mistakes, but his reaction was completely different from what the lady had imagined. The young man cried bitterly, although he should have been happy with another girl, and that was how it was in the original novel. She didn't know what to do or whether she should console the young man, but she tried to remain calm, because her heart couldn't waver. Benjamin, with a sad face, admitted that he would do as the lady wished. But there was one problem. Divorces of high nobility are heard by the royal court, and every action they take has an impact on the empire in one way or another. There is also a period of reconciliation, during which they must meet frequently and spend time together, and may have to attend official events. Benjamin asked the lady not to worry too much, as this was only the worst-case scenario. He apologized to his wife and promised to take care of the necessary paperwork. Grace asked for a good rest, as they had a long process ahead of them. The action takes place in the office of the Crown Prince, where the young man was incredibly bored every day. For the Crown Prince named Sylvester, it seemed like nothing interesting was happening in this life. He was not eager to do business, but that day his butler came to him with unexpected news. The Crown Prince asked his assistant what the urgency was, knowing full well that it was best not to disturb Sylvester. The assistant held a document in his hands, stating that a petition for divorce had just been received. It was a petition for divorce from high nobles, and Sylvester wondered who it could have come from. Once Sylvester learned that the document came from the Duke of Felton's family, he did not believe that the couple had decided to divorce. Grace had already read the documents and learned about the 8-month period for reconciliation, and for her it was a very long time. She asked what she should do during this time, since she could not escape the conditions. The butler suggested that the lady, if she didn't mind, have dinner with the gentleman, and Grace even asked his question again. Eating together is also considered a marital activity and is taken into account when the Imperial Department assesses the fulfillment of marital duties. But that didn't mean Grace had to stay in the main building, and they say that this category is given special attention. Grace warned the butler that she was going to leave for a short while and return for dinner, but a knight was required to accompany her on the walk. The lady was planning to visit the shelter again, so she agreed to the conditions. In the palace in recent days, the walls seemed to be suffocating her, and the lady wanted to use this as an excuse to go out into the city. Walking slowly down the corridor, she felt a cool breeze blowing from somewhere. She saw that one of the windows was open, so she immediately went to it to see what was happening below. She looked closely at the fragrant garden, but noticed something strange that had definitely not been there before. The heroine went outside to check something, and she clearly remembered that the item she needed should be somewhere in the garden. Grace's eye fell on a very small and light stone, and for some reason she paid attention to it. Taking it in her hands, the lady felt strange, but something told her to pick up this stone. As she looked at the small stone, the lady felt a bad premonition, and she was sure of her feelings. She seemed to see her reflection in this stone, and tried to examine it even more closely. Through the stone, she saw an extravagant carriage, from which a young man in a luxurious, expensive suit was getting out. It was a fairly young man with dark hair, but Grace didn't immediately realize who she was seeing. But as soon as the young man turned around, she immediately realized that it was Crown Prince Sylvester Bayman. It was the main character of the original story, and Grace was still looking at the reflection in the stone with excitement. She didn't know why she saw him, but at that moment the maid Sally approached her. Sally had been looking for the lady for some time, and finally found her sitting in the garden with some strange stone in her hands. Grace showed it to the maid, saying that the stone seemed a little strange, but Sally had heard that light stones were more in fashion now than black ones. Grace insisted that wasn't the case at all, and that there was clearly something wrong with the stone. She still held it in her hands, insisting that this small, light-colored stone was not just any ordinary stone. And the next second, something happened that no one expected, and the small stone exploded right in the mistress's hands. Sally was horrified by what she saw, and drops of blood slowly trickled down Grace's hand. The ladies went to bandage the wounds. The stone exploded right in the girl's hand, and no one could believe what had happened. It was good that Sally was there to provide first aid, and she told me that His Highness the Crown Prince had arrived today and would probably stay for dinner. Grace felt she needed to escape quickly, but she had injured her right hand, insisting that it would be difficult to maintain table etiquette and awkward to dine with anyone but her loved ones. But on the other hand, she was glad that she had hurt her hand, declaring that she and Benjamin could have dinner another time. Sally asked the lady to be more careful and cautious on the road in the future, and the lady went for the walk she had planned to take. She walked slowly along the luxurious corridor of the main palace, and she had not been in this part of the building for a long time. Suddenly, she heard men's voices nearby, and stopped to listen to what they were talking about. It was Benjamin and the Crown Prince. They were talking in raised tones, and Sylvester insisted that it was completely impossible to talk to the young man. Right before the lady's eyes stood Crown Prince Sylvester, who for some reason was shouting at Benjamin. Seeing a girl passing by, Sylvester asked who she was, because he had definitely seen her somewhere before. Benjamin didn't even have time to introduce his wife to the Crown Prince, but immediately approached her and asked what brought the girl here. Seeing the lady's bandaged hand, he became worried, but Grace came up with a story about a broken mirror, which she allegedly injured herself on. Benjamin carefully took the girl's bandaged hand, assuring her that she was quite seriously injured and probably needed medical attention. Grace assured her that her hand was perfectly fine, as the maid had already treated the wounds. At that moment, the Crown Prince approached the couple and asked if he was interfering with their pleasant conversation. Benjamin patted the Crown Prince on the head, asking him to behave decently, and Sylvester's high status did not give him the right to be rude to his wife. The Duke asked Milady to wait a moment while he took His Highness to his room and returned quickly. Grace was glad that Benjamin was about to leave and really wanted him not to come back. But Benjamin soon returned to his wife, asking if she really felt well. He assured that His Highness was not a bad person at all, and they had known each other since childhood, but perhaps his behavior might seem rude. Grace didn't pay any attention to this, because she had completely different concerns. Benjamin offered to accompany the lady to the place where she was going, and my lady had to agree. The lady just wanted to visit the shelter and ask how Cleta was doing. The teacher was very surprised to see Grace on the doorstep. She was very happy, so an interesting conversation awaited the girls, and Cleta was happy to tell them about the new life of the orphanage. When Cleta saw Mrs. Linden, she was very happy and admitted that she felt very empty without Grace. But all this time, the lady was confident that everything was fine in the shelter and that things were going quite smoothly. Her expectations were met. The shelter secured long-term contracts with institutions, produced custom products, and at this rate, they were certain to be successful. After some thought, Cleta admitted that she would like to visit the plantations, but the train takes forever, and the gate fee is so high that she hasn't even gone near them. Grace explained that it was best not to use the gates, as there were rumors that their energy source was unstable, although this had previously only happened in certain areas. The lady thought about the gate, but her memories of it were horrifying, and it was definitely not their option. This happened when the western gate failed, resulting in numerous casualties. Then a terrible event happened, and the gates exploded. Most of the local residents were seriously injured. Every resident of the empire knew about this catastrophe. The situation was tragic and caused pain to everyone who was not indifferent to it. The gate connects different places through connecting passages, and although all the people were saved, they were left deeply shocked and mentally traumatized. Because of this disaster, Arya ended up going on an expedition, stopping at tea plantations to bless them, and if the lady manages to prevent the disaster, it could hit their business hard. The mistress valued human lives above money, so she suggested continuing to use carriages instead of gates. Later, when they had more resources, they could hire escorts. The lady was getting ready to go to the tea plantations, and the good-natured ladies from the shelter wished her a good journey and were looking forward to her speedy return. Grace needed to go to the Gate Control Bureau. It sounded reckless, but she figured out how to use her position to prevent a disaster, and if everything went well, Benjamin would not be blamed for the incident. If a man who has done 100 good deeds makes even one mistake, those around him will tear him to pieces. Even Benjamin, who came up with the idea of transporting through the gate. Journalists, bribed by hostile nobles, will flood the newspapers with slanderous articles, causing Benjamin great harm and Arya to become his consolation. If she was going to prevent a disaster, the course of the plot might probably change. But for now, she decided to focus on saving people. To do this, you need to create a fake situation in which they will have to check the gate today. So Grace had an important mission today, and standing in front of the gate control office, she was going to cause a little commotion there. Due to her intolerance to magic, she was about to faint in the bureau, and then Benjamin would check the gate connected to the west and immediately discover the problem. It was the quickest and easiest solution, so Grace decided to go ahead with it without hesitation. The closer Grace got to the magical gate, the more her body reacted, and the sensation turned out to be much more unpleasant than she expected. Suddenly, she felt like a little girl again, who was constantly laughed at by children, and who didn't even have any friends as a child. All the children laughed at her freckles, which covered Grace's entire face, and the children laughed at her, calling her dirty, and no one could help her cope with them. Little Grace considered herself a complete loser, whom no one would ever help, and all the children turned away from her, not wanting to be friends. The children laughed at the girl, and she felt her heart squeeze with pain, and her only friend Gilbert stood to the side and pretended as if nothing was happening. She wanted him to come to her aid, to protect her from ridicule, but he only looked at the ground, and this was even more painful than the laughter of other children. Surrounded by children laughing and pulling the girl's hair, Grace begged Gilbert not to leave her alone, but the boy had already made his choice, leaving his girl all alone among the children bullying her. But it was just a dream about memories for little Grace, and waking up in her bed, the heroine realized how painful and unpleasant it was for the heroine when she was a child. The lady opened her eyes and realized that this dream belonged to the heroine Grace, and now she knew how terribly she was bullied by other children as a child. She woke up in the morning feeling depressed, wondering if she had acted too rashly yesterday. Yesterday's hike turned out to be not the most pleasant event, and a minute ago everything was fine with the girl, But soon, everything changed dramatically. When she approached the main gate, she immediately felt heaviness and severe dizziness, so she could not stand on her feet. She remembered that yesterday she had lost consciousness in 1 second and fainted, but there was an escort next to her who immediately provided assistance to the lady. Of course, Grace knew about the intolerance to magic, but it turned out to be much worse than she expected, and perhaps there was a more reasonable way to deal with it. But the heroine was too impatient, and it was necessary to act quickly to force the gate to be checked. She felt absolutely terrible, and only now realized what a reckless act she had committed. But, however, she considered it unsurprising, because Grace always felt useless. During the festival, everything was different, and the heroine simply hated this place, where she heard such things even when she was at peace. She didn't understand why her thoughts continued to be so confused, and whether she really was that useless. She didn't know what to believe anymore, and her head was a complete chaos of thoughts from the past, Grace, and the present heroine. Getting out of bed, she heard some sounds coming from under the window, and this definitely couldn't be happening. Walking to the window, Grace carefully opened it to make sure there was no one downstairs, and that she was probably just imagining things. Looking into the yard, the lady was surprised, assuming that it was Mr. Benjamin standing below, and that it was he who was calling her. Having opened the window completely, the heroine realized that it was just tree branches hitting the glass, and she had actually imagined it. She felt a cool breeze gently touch her face, bringing with it the freshness of the evening chill. But to her surprise, she saw Benjamin below, who shouted her name so that she wouldn't stand by the window, since she had just recently lost consciousness and was not yet well rested. Grace apologized and asked the young man for forgiveness, being sure that she had probably caused him a lot of trouble. And she didn't want to faint like that, and if she had known it would end like that, she wouldn't have even tried. Benjamin didn't respond to these words and pretended not to hear them, starting to talk about the tea bags that he regularly buys for food to send north, along with supplies. And thanks to Grace, the Northerners can now enjoy delicious tea. The lady replied that it was not incredibly difficult for her, and anyone could have thought of such a thing. But the young man claimed that it was she who brought this idea to life and helped many people try the new drink, and she was definitely the first in this matter. Now, even if supplies were sent north, the shelter could be covered for a long time. But most of all, Grace was pleased by Benjamin's praise, which made her feel a little happier. The young man admitted that he had recently been to the gate control office due to the incident with Grace, so he began actively checking the gate. He asked the ladies' forgiveness and said that he would like to talk about Saint Aria, if the ladies were ready to listen to his words. The lady wanted to talk about this girl, but now she was definitely not ready to discuss such a serious topic. Benjamin admitted that the girl must be uncomfortable, and it's likely that he's being too persistent right now, so they can easily postpone the conversation to another time. In fact, Grace really wanted to hear the truth, so she agreed to talk right now. But it felt a little strange to continue talking like that through the window when the boy was downstairs. So she asked him if he wanted to come in. I was incredibly happy as soon as I heard that Grace invited him into her room, because this had definitely never happened before. Grace saw Benjamin happily run into the outbuilding, and she didn't even understand why she invited him. The lady became very agitated and thought that due to her poor health, she had completely gone crazy and her emotions were completely out of control. But it was too late, and she had just called Benjamin into her room to talk, and there was simply no point in blaming herself. She just had to get ready for the meeting with Benjamin in the shortest possible time. But when she looked at herself in the mirror and saw her appearance, Grace was simply horrified. Her disheveled hair hung like straw on her head, and her face was tired and frightened. But looking at herself in the mirror again, she decided that she probably shouldn't be worried about anything like that right now, other than her perfect appearance. The lady didn't even have time to understand anything when she heard a loud knock on the bedroom door. The very next second, Benjamin entered the room, incredibly happy to see his wife. He wished Milady good evening and asked why she was standing to greet him when she could not even get out of bed due to her poor health. But the lady was not used to greeting guests lying in bed, so the heroine greeted her husband standing. The young man admitted that they were one family, and if the lady felt unwell, she could go to bed, and he would sit next to her, and they could talk calmly. Benjamin began the conversation by saying that he had been very ill as a child, and it had not gotten better, so his parents were extremely concerned about his health. But one day, something happened, and it was something else entirely, for suddenly Benjamin recovered, and after that, his parents became very religious. He wanted to get closer to the saint for other reasons. He wanted to become friends with her, and later introduce Arya to his wife. Benjamin even suggested going to a temple together sometime, and it would be a great place for a first meeting. Grace didn't know whether to believe that Raisin simply wanted to be her friend, or that he had other ulterior motives, but she decided to give him a try. The young man claimed that he and Arya could hardly be called friends, and he openly admitted this to his wife. The next day, the young couple went to the temple to verify the truth of Benjamin's words. Walking down the street with her smiling husband, Grace couldn't understand how it had all come to this, because now, for the first time, they were simply having a good time. Grace remembered Benjamin telling her that when they were heading to the temple, he asked her not to go too far. And they go there together only so that Grace no longer feels lied to by her husband. Therefore, he was happy to introduce his wife to Saint Arya, without hiding anything from each other. But there was still one small detail that Grace would like to change in Benjamin's clothes. She took off the dark green headband from her hair and carefully wanted to hand it to her husband. She tied a beautiful men's bow on his white shirt, because it will look much more attractive. Benjamin's face burned brightly with embarrassment, and he immediately decided to make sure that this bow did not come undone under any circumstances. As Grace walked leisurely about her business, she heard a familiar female voice nearby and turned around. She saw the frightened teacher Cleta in front of her, and their meeting was very unexpected. And from the girl's face, the lady understood that something terrible had happened. Grace asked what the rush was about and what had happened, but the out-of-breath teacher couldn't even say a word because she was so worried. Having calmed down a little, with tears in her eyes, she confessed that someone had recently broken into the shelter and caused extensive damage. The lady immediately put aside her business with Benjamin, and they, together with the teacher, went to help the orphanage and find out what really happened there. All the things were scattered, so Grace suggested sorting what could still be used and what couldn't. Benjamin also tried to find out if Cleta had seen anyone strange here lately. The shelter was in complete disarray, but there were no signs of a break-in, and Benjamin found the situation unusual. He didn't know much about the shelter, so he decided to ask. But there was something else important he wanted to tell. The young man was sure that Grace needed rest from everything that was happening, and he was very worried about her. He invited the lady to go outside and get some fresh air, and promised to check the rest himself. Grace found this rather strange, and wondered if the young man was seriously going to throw her out the door. But the young man insisted that his wife needed to go outside and breathe a little. As soon as the lady came out into the yard, she was immediately surrounded by the children of the orphanage, who were incredibly happy to see her. She suggested that the children play, so that they wouldn't go inside and see what happened there. Grace remained outside with the children, and Benjamin asked the teacher's name and decided to sort things out himself. The shelter was completely ransacked, but the gold was not touched, and there were no signs of a break-in. Therefore, Benjamin assumed that someone had done it, but it was unclear why this person would destroy his own home. The workshop turned out to be intact, since there were objects there that were dangerous for children, so it was locked and not touched. Benjamin had a theory that someone could have entered as one of their own, but did not know the location of the chest and could not open the workshop door, in which case there is only one suspect. While Benjamin tried to understand what had happened at the shelter, Grace watched the children happily playing in the yard. A little girl approached Grace and wanted to ask her something, and turned to the lady. She whispered to Grace that she shouldn't tell anyone about this, but she decided to turn to an adult. Since the girl knew that Grace was not an employee of the shelter, she asked if she would believe him if he told the truth. The lady understood perfectly well that the child would hardly lie to her, and she really wanted to listen to her. The girl said that a strange man asked about Grace, but he was so unpleasant that they didn't tell him anything. Then he started asking everyone different questions, and then told them not to tell anyone. The lady held her breath and realized that something strange was clearly happening here, something connected specifically with her. This meant that someone had already gotten on Grace's trail and was interested in her person. The lady rushed to look for Benjamin, because after this girl's question, she realized something. The young man excitedly asked what had happened to my lady, since she was running and shouting his name in a breathless voice. Grace immediately explained that another problem had come up that she needed to deal with, so she needed to take the day off. Cleta apologized for keeping the lady when she was not feeling well, so she wanted to try to sort everything out herself. Grace felt she needed to step away from the shelter, as everything that was happening was causing her anxiety and stress. Benjamin understood her perfectly, but he was sure that before it wasn't the other way around, that he liked to look there. Grace said that one of the children noticed a strange, frightening man, and it was probably the newspaper man. Benjamin asked if Grace really thought the newspaper man was the person who broke into the shelter and was an accomplice. But everyone was sure that the director of the orphanage, who had escaped from it long ago, was primarily involved in everything. According to the lady, the money was kept in a chest in the bedroom closet, and the premises previously used by the director are now empty. Most likely, the director turned everything in the shelter upside down in search of a new location for the chest, and then escaped, and everyone was very lucky that the chest was hidden. In order to reveal the identity of the newspaper man, Grace was even ready to go out alone at night in order to arouse him with her appearance. The young man, of course, refused. He was sure that this was not a very good idea for the girl for her own safety. After all, she had just fainted, and all this was too risky, but Grace was not going to put herself in danger. He agreed to listen to his wife, because she really wanted him to hear her plan. The newspaper man was a man named Tom Birkin, who was assigned to pursue his goal. His only goal was money, and he wanted to create gossip to enrich himself, so this was the only reason that made him relentlessly pursue Lady Grace. He knew very well that ladies rarely went out lately, so it was difficult to predict when she would be on the city streets again. But unexpectedly for himself, one dark night, he saw a familiar dark blue robe in the distance. Her red curls were fluttering in the wind, and the newspaper man immediately thought that the lady had dared to go out alone at night. Watching the passing figure in the blue robe, the newspaper man was surprised that the lady was walking completely alone without security. Following the girl in the blue robe, the newspaper man felt a little guilty, but still couldn't help but do it, because he only needed to look at her face. And for the sake of money, he was ready to do anything, even scare a girl at night. Putting his hand on his shoulder, not even a second passed before the blade of a sharp ball appeared in front of the young man. Before him stood the deputy commander of the Second Knightly Order, named Rosalia Vantrin. The lady said the young man had been arrested for endangering the Duchess's life and was charged with a serious crime. After the successful mission, Rosalia returned to the Duchess and reported that she had caught the newspaper man. Grace had no doubts about this girl at all, because her command skills were excellent. She presented the mantle to the lady, apologizing for dropping it on the ground while carrying it in her hands. For Grace, it was just a robe that could be washed. The main thing was that Rosalia successfully completed the task and remained safe. Letya admitted that she still had something to report, something that Grace absolutely needed to know. She gave her the suitcase containing Tom Birkin's belongings, and it appeared he was not carrying any dangerous items. The lady thanked Rosalia for her excellent service and promised to reward her generously. Rosalia was sure that she was only doing her duty, and this was the mistress's order, and therefore it was right to give these things to her. Vantrin was the finest of the Empire's female knights, and as a knight sworn to serve the Duchess, she considered this task an honor. Grace hoped that her request had not been a burden to Rosalia, and for some reason she believed the girl, because she had handled it admirably and seemed resilient. The newspaper man was thrown into prison, and for some reason he was sure that this was where his life would end. He assumed that the Duchess would punish him to the fullest extent, since she held a high title. But suddenly he saw in front of him a man whom he certainly did not expect to see now. He shouted that before him stood the very same Duchess of Felton, about whom he had known for a long time. Grace stood in front of the young man with an impassive face, wanting to know the whole truth. She immediately stated that if the young man tried to do something bad, she would immediately call the guards. At that moment, for some reason, the young man thought that the rumors were exaggerated and that a noble lady was standing before him. Although everyone said that Mrs. Felton was stupid, ugly, and fat, this girl turned out to be just ordinary and did not at all correspond to the rumors. Grace read everything the newspaperman had managed to find out and admitted that the young man had done quite a meticulous job. He asked if the lady had come to hold him accountable for such a gross violation. Grace said Benjamin is ready to bring the boy to justice, but given the current situation, a more severe punishment may be imposed. So she decided to give him another chance and came to tell him exactly that. If the young man decides to take advantage of this opportunity, he will not receive a life sentence at trial. The young man grinned and asked if summer death could really threaten him in such a stupid way. The lady believed that this man had no right to complain about threats, because he was the one who ridiculed the appearance of others for money. Tom Birkin had already been framed for his records, and after handing over a note found in the ransacked shelter, the lady reported that it was he who had committed the attack. Now the newspaperman realized that the rumors about the Duchess were completely false, and she was clearly not such a stupid girl with freckles as the ridiculous rumors said. He assumed that Grace wanted to make some kind of deal with him, or perhaps she wanted something from him. The lady was incredibly glad that she had managed to find the person who had been spreading false rumors about her behind her back. And now you can learn the story that was not described in the original, and there was still a lot that you wanted to know. But for now, it was necessary to focus on urgent matters. The information she provided to Tom Birkin was quite valuable, so it immediately caught his attention. It concerned the location of a necklace called the Blessing of the Sun, which was passed down from generation to generation by saints. People began to judge when the temple stopped displaying it, and the indicated place could not help but attract a newspaperman, who immediately appeared there. Grace was glad she knew the original story, and Tom Birkin would probably use the information about the necklace to get out of this. The lady still had a lot of things to do, and the first thing she had to do was find the director of the shelter. Benjamin was also involved in this case, and was confident that the directors would be proven guilty to the fullest extent of the law. After this, he will be prohibited from entering the shelter's premises and will never be able to hold this position again. The lady also wanted Cleta to have ownership rights to the shelters and be able to manage them independently. And if Grace manages to do all this, she will be very pleased with a good result. She wanted all problems to be easily solved, but for some reason she was very afraid that she would not succeed. The inner voice screamed at Grace that she would soon fail, and she knew it perfectly well, instilling in the girl a fear of action. He still haunted the young lady, and she tried to deal with him every day. And again, she had some kind of nightmare, where she was supposedly being convinced that nothing would work out for her. This morning, she decided to go for a walk, and immediately met Mr. Benjamin, who inquired about her condition. As soon as the lady stepped out into the fresh air, she immediately remembered the events of the previous night. The weather was simply wonderful, and the heroine enjoyed the warm sun, and did not even notice that Benjamin approached her. He understood that now was not the best time for fun, but he invited the lady to join him and have a good time. She was surprised, because they were definitely not going anywhere today, and this proposal from the young man came spontaneously. Benjamin suggested exploring the outskirts of the capital, and Grace guessed he must be worried because she looked depressed. He suggested that he first take the girl to the outbuilding so that she could get ready, and then they could set off on their journey together. The inner voice continued to rise inside Grace and insisted that the young man was kind to her only out of pity, because she could only evoke sympathy. She even suggested that she had become too kind and frank with Benjamin, who would probably lie in the future and fall in love with someone else. During their walk, the butler approached them and asked the gentleman for a moment, as an urgent matter had arisen that required his attention. He handed him a letter, which the young man began to examine with particular attention, but was in no hurry to open it. He stayed at the outbuilding and asked Grace to take her time and join him whenever it was convenient for her. She promised to try to get ready as quickly as possible, but everyone felt that there was no need to rush and that they should collect their thoughts. A luxurious carriage, decorated with gilded patterns, sped briskly along forest paths. But for the gentleman, this carriage was too simple, although the Duchess did not think so at all. On the contrary, she was glad that she was incredibly comfortable in it, and asked where they were going. On the outskirts, there was a place called the Flower House, which had previously been looked after by the Marquis Charles, and now they were heading there. They were heading to a greenhouse, built of glass, which keeps the heat inside and allows you to admire various flowers. Benjamin went there because his wife was interested in flowers. Suddenly, the lady noticed that something was bothering Benjamin and decided to immediately inquire about it. The young man admitted that there was no way to deceive a lady's eyes, and that in fact, there was a problem with the Rondel Canal. Although the cleaning was almost complete, it was still not in the best condition. There is a large workshop of magical artifacts located near the canal, and there is a suspicion that they could have somehow influenced the situation, but this accusation also sounded absurd. The Duke had other priorities, so Grace suggested they go there together and find out what the problem was. Benjamin was surprised, because if they went there with his wife, the lady would find herself in a crowded place. Grace smiled and replied that everything would be perfectly fine, and since the young man would be next to her, no one would come close. The young man was indeed happy to ensure that no one came near his wife, and he thanked my lady for the offer. After some time, they arrived at the appointed place, and the Duke and his wife went out into the world for the first time in a long time. The temple could also carry out the cleaning of the channel, but not as thoroughly as the saint, and apparently they focused on temporary peace until the main reason was clarified. And in the end, they possess a small fraction of the power of the saint. Hearing this, Grace thought for a moment, and a very interesting idea came into her head. The priests from the temple came towards them, and the Duke respectfully introduced his wife, but the lady was sure that everyone would be disappointed. The young man told her about his plans, and even Grace agreed to come here when she learned about the current situation. The lady didn't understand whether she really wanted this or not, but a hostile voice in her head assured her that the young man would definitely feel awkward because of her, and it would be better for her not to come here at all. Everyone knew that Saint Arya was busy cleaning the canal and was definitely somewhere nearby. The girl did not keep them waiting long, so soon everyone turned around and saw a beautiful lady with long white hair. Saint Arya admitted that the Rondel Canal had become polluted again, so she used more divine power. Seeing Arya up close for the first time, Grace was surprised at how much of a different aura she truly had. And as soon as this girl stopped next to her, the voice that was constantly sounding in her head finally died down. Saint Arya Miller possessed unrivaled divine powers and was gifted with an incredibly angelic appearance. She was the only saint in the world who possessed such great magical power. Grace didn't want the girl to spend all her energy on this matter alone, because it could cause the magical artifact workshop to fail. Ms. Linden completely forgot that magical artifacts and divine power are poorly compatible, and it is definitely better not to do this. Grace decided that her husband would probably want to talk to Arya alone, but the young man refused with a smile. He only wanted to introduce the girls to each other, but Arya was probably busy right now, and it would be difficult for her to meet again. Grace asked if they had looked elsewhere for the cause, but everyone insisted that they had checked other places and still hadn't been able to find the cause. Grace was sure that the source originated in one place, and in the end, the root of the problem was definitely not here. However, she only knew this information because she had read the original and did not know how to push people to reveal another reason. It took Arya a long time to get the Rondel Canal back in order, and the saint expended a lot of energy. But no matter how hard she tried, the water still didn't become crystal clear, and the reason definitely lay elsewhere. The lady asked if it would be possible to trace the source using sacred power, and perhaps determine the direction of the spread of the pollution. Finding this idea excellent, Benjamin asked the lady to tell him in more detail how this could be done. Grace was sure that if the divine power was drawn into a thin, long thread, it would rush to the source of the filth, stretching as far as possible, and if everything worked out, the cost of labor would decrease. I immediately approached the lady priestess, who was involved with the temple, with one interesting question. He asked the saint to spare them a little time, because his wise wife had just made an interesting suggestion. They replied that Arya was busy at the moment, but the young man said that it might make her work easier. The young man assured her that his wife would now be able to tell him a great idea. But Grace suddenly became very frightened and declared that she was tired and would like to rest in the carriage. She was sure that Benjamin trusted her, and she really wanted him to tell her everything. Benjamin, hearing his wife's request, decided to accompany her to the carriage and do as she said. Grace was indeed feeling very tired because she had too much work to do. Looking at Arya, who was standing next to her husband, She supposed that they really did look very good together. They really did look like a wonderful couple, and the heroine thought with bitterness that even her appearance did not suit her husband. Grace must have had some negative thoughts about what she saw, but now she felt like everything was fine, and the bad thoughts seemed to have disappeared from her head. So she calmly waited until her husband had come to an agreement with the saint, and soon she was expecting him in the carriage. The young man reported that the lady's method could indeed be used to trace the source, but the saint said it might take a little longer. When the Duke explained to the people that everything that was happening was being done only for their benefit, they calmed down and happily agreed. So they got it done faster than expected, and now you can visit the flower house. As soon as the Duke and his wife sat down in the carriage, there was a knock at the window, and the young man saw a hand in a white glove. Suddenly, a man standing in a hat near the carriage said that they had recently been informed of a fire in the shelter where the lady had come. The lady did not believe his words, because there had just been an attack at the shelter, and could something bad really happen to them again? It was decided to set out immediately, and Benjamin set out with full determination, accompanied by her wife, but everyone very much hoped that the shelter had not been seriously damaged. Grace really wanted to believe that no serious problems would happen, but as soon as they arrived at the place, she looked in horror at the blazing tongues of flame bursting out of the windows of the shelter. They rushed to the scene and soon saw the fire blazing brightly, engulfing the walls of the building. But the flames were too strong, and they fought them as best they could. A fire suddenly broke out inside, resulting in only minor burns to the children, but everyone was alive. Everyone had suspicions that, judging by everything, this was not a simple accident, and that someone had deliberately set fire to the building. An unconscious man was found at the scene of the fire, and since women and children lived in the shelter, he was the prime suspect. A teacher immediately came out to see what kind of man was near the shelter. The girl was incredibly scared and was still coughing from the smoke she had inhaled inside the building while saving the children. She asked permission to tell something, and everyone knew that Cleta would tell the truth. Benjamin was happy to listen to her, since she was right at the scene of the incident. As it turned out, this man was originally the director of the shelter, but she had no idea how he managed to get inside the building. He started a fire right where the oil was stored, but it is strange that he did not leave the building immediately. Before all the children had left, the director said something very strange, and then completely lost consciousness. Cleet repeated his words, and he clearly admitted that it was revenge on the Duke and his wife, and these were his words before he fell senseless near the threshold. Hearing these words, the heroine became incredibly frightened, and now she no longer had any doubts that something was threatening her and the Duke. She couldn't believe that there were people who were ready to take revenge without even knowing the person personally. As soon as Grace heard that all this was for revenge, that same ominous voice appeared in her head, claiming that it was her fault, and that if the mistress had obediently sat in the room, nothing would have happened. After hearing this, the lady felt very ill, and it was as if a lightning bolt had struck her body. Benjamin saw his wife become ill, so he asked her to leave the scene immediately. She could not understand whether this meant that everything that had been done was in revenge against the Duke's wife. She understood that these people lived nearby, and if this was located next to the Duke's house, then something inexplicable could happen. In an instant, Grace seemed to be completely lost in reality, and her head began to spin from the realization of one important thought. She decided to confess everything to Benjamin, because he also had the right to know the whole truth. Grace said that instead of asking the people from the shelter, she wanted Benjamin to be able to place them somewhere, since they were left without their only home. Benjamin was sure. He didn't even think that his wife would say otherwise, because she was a very noble girl, and the residents of the shelter must be very worried now. She asked to take the people and children to a safe place, and Benjamin immediately agreed to fulfill her kind request. Grace continued to be plagued by nightmares, and a voice in her head kept telling her that she was a stupid and worthless woman who truly thought she had done nothing wrong. The heroine was quite tired of negative thoughts, and now she was the only reason. The maid Sally greeted her mistress, who had just woken up, with a welcoming smile. The lady sadly admitted that she couldn't get out of bed yet because she was incredibly tired, and asked about the latest news. The children were taken to a safe place, and they moved into the main building, and the gentleman went to the palace for a short while. She asked the maid to make tea for the guests from the shelter, because they were probably incredibly tired and also wanted to rest. The lady asked to bring a girl named Cleta to her room to discuss some urgent matter with her. Bowing respectfully, Sally promised to fulfill the request immediately and went to the guests. The last few days had been very busy, and the Duchess didn't even expect that all the residents of the shelter would end up visiting her. At first, she still worked for Grace's future, then for the people from the shelter, but in the end, for some reason, everything still turned against her. She was very afraid of the meeting, because she thought that they might be offended by her, and she felt very worried. Cleta happily went out to the lady and informed her that she had not confessed properly at all and was afraid that the teacher might be uncomfortable being in her house. But the excited teacher responded with enthusiasm that everything was just wonderful, and she was incredibly glad that the lady had helped with overnight accommodations. Grace tried to ignore the negative thoughts in her head that said they wouldn't have needed a place to stay if the shelter hadn't burned down. The teacher immediately admitted that she did not believe that the arson was committed specifically because of the Duchess. Therefore, she immediately admitted that none of them believed such gossip, and the Duchess and Miss Linden were completely different people because of those rumors. After all, she took care of them all this time, didn't abandon them. Even when they made unfounded assumptions, she still placed them in a wonderful place. Grace smiled and realized that she could not do otherwise, because these people desperately needed her help. But unfortunately, the women with whom Cleta worked had encountered many prejudices in life, and after everything that had happened, sometimes spoke carelessly about the Duchess. So Cleta talked to all of them, and the ladies wanted to apologize for what they said earlier. After all, no matter what happens, this is not a reason to speak badly about the person who has been helping the shelter all this time. Cleta considered Grace a benefactor she had been fortunate enough to meet at the festival, and they did not believe any of the rumors of revenge. Therefore, the lady said that if the lady needed help, she could always contact them. Grace decided to leave the tea business to Clete and the orphanage and retire, giving them a new home on the land where the tea plantation would be located. This land was blessed by Saint Aria, and for the first time, the purest water flowed there, and the desperate leaves grew of excellent quality. Now the shelter's residents and children can help each other and be proud of their work, living simply happily. Benjamin was incredibly proud of his wife, because the proposed method gave excellent results. He was sure that no one would have even thought of such a thing, considering his wife to be simply an incredibly noble person who did not close her eyes and helped those in need. For some reason, Ms. Grace felt strange receiving praise, because it was the first time in her life. She asked if she could join the expedition to the polluted area because she wanted to participate too. Benjamin warned that it could be quite dangerous, but he saw his wife's sincere desire. The road there was grueling, and the young man was not sure that Grace could cope, but she assured him that she really wanted to go there and just wanted to help in any way she could. In fact, Grace needed a reason to leave, because this mission made her realize that unless she took action on her own, there might be no talk of restoring her reputation. But the only problem was whether Benjamin would allow her to go into such harsh conditions. The young man thought about it, but the lady insisted so confidently, and she really wanted to help where someone was in need. After some thought, Benjamin happily agreed to fulfill his wife's request and confidently stated that they would do just that. The next day, a messenger was sent to the palace with new information, which was provided for the Duke. After reading the information, Grace realized that it seemed like there was no longer any need to worry about Birkin's trial, since everything had turned out in their favor. But there was still some important work that the heroine needed to do. She had to ask him to investigate the case with the drug, introduce it, and also it was necessary to know the whole truth. On the day of departure, Sally saw Grace off, and she assured her that thanks to her beloved assistant, she could breathe a sigh of relief. The knight Rosalia went with them, and now Sally was sure that no one would dare harm the honorable lady. Rosalia asked the lady not to forget that they were always close by, and therefore no one would dare to lay a finger on her. The lady was surprised why they were saying such nice words to her, and sincerely thanked the girls. She really wanted to believe that they really trusted the lady, but Grace still couldn't fully believe them. They probably respect her because of Saint Aria, who was the most honorable person in the empire. Surely everyone knows that Benjamin and Arya are close, so people who like her support her. The heroine felt that there were people around her who really liked her as a person. The lady smiled sweetly and thanked Sally and Rosalia for their care and trust, and was incredibly happy. Lady Sally was even surprised, because it was the first time the lady had smiled at them in such a long time of being together. It was time for Grace to leave, and she asked Sally if the young gentleman would be coming out soon. As soon as Grace said these words, an excited young man immediately appeared before her eyes, apologizing for being late. The young man came out just in time, and the lady suggested that they move slowly in order to arrive on time at the appointed time. The head of the country's pharmacology was Duke Zart, the current emperor's younger brother, and if Grace's medicine was prescribed, it most likely passed through his hands. He barely appeared in the original story, but since he's popping up in Grace's memories, she better be careful. Duke Benjamin and his wife Grace arrived in the abandoned area to explore the ancient lands. What they saw with their own eyes was truly terrible, and Grace was sure that things were much better here. The distribution of humanitarian aid remained a priority, so Benjamin suggested hurrying up. The lady said they also need to determine who needs humanitarian aid. Benjamin said that they had already conducted an investigation on their part and had some information. The butler provided the gentleman with a list compiled according to the number of people in the area and the urgent needs of the patients. The young man did an excellent job, and Grace then suggested that they share the responsibilities. Benjamin didn't quite understand what his wife meant by the word split, and asked what it meant. Seeing two unfamiliar young men, the Duke asked if it was really the geologists that Grace had brought with her. Since the land was polluted, the heroine thought that geologists could help, so she decided to invite them to go to the abandoned lands. She was confident that thanks to these people, they would be able to quickly find the source of the contamination and prepare everything that was needed. The lady admitted that not only she dealt with this matter, but Benjamin also paid a lot of attention to solving this problem. Grace felt goosebumps running through her body, not understanding why she was reacting this way to praise, while Benjamin continued to please her and show her respect. They were asked to tell where they had arrived, as he had seen that some groups were studying the crops of the Earth family, and that research was probably being conducted here. Grace confirmed that her goal is similar, but slightly different. What the heroine was actually heading towards was an abandoned mine in Ardell County. When Arya cleared the place, the locals were so grateful that they didn't know how to repay, and eventually, the problematic mine was donated to the temple. But eventually, it will be purchased by the Felton family and donated to the temple on behalf of the people of the West. They came here to announce the existence of this mine, but they thought they had come to look for living plants in the forest afterwards. Grace gave the geologists a box of tape so they could mark the area with anomalies and be sure to tag them on their way back. She asked if she felt uncomfortable walking alone, so they could go with the knight Rosalia as an escort. By the evening, some information about the lands was already known, and as expected, among the living plants, there was completely dead land. Benjamin was with his wife all this time, helping to solve many issues. Grace asked if the young man could spare her a little time that night to sort out some problems. At first, the young man stated that there would be reconnaissance at night, and it would certainly be difficult to see each other. Grace had already become upset, but Benjamin immediately admitted that tonight would be an exception, because he always had time for his wife. The lady said that she would wait until the reconnaissance was completed, and since there was something that should remain only between them, their meeting could take place at dawn. Benjamin didn't expect his wife to want to see him, and he really hoped that she genuinely wanted to see him. He was delighted and replied that he would try to finish his business as quickly as possible and come to Grace right away. Grace had no intention of waiting for the young man until late, and even regretted her decision a little, because Benjamin looked rather strange. The moon brightly illuminated the barren lands, on which not a single living tree or green blade of grass grew. They moved slowly along the path, lighting the way with the flashlight that Benjamin held in his hands. Suddenly, Benjamin covered his eyes with his hands, and the lady became worried that he probably became afraid to be there. He admitted that he was sure Grace wanted to explain something important in private, so he suggested that they have a private conversation. But the lady assured them that they could talk while they walked and surveyed the lands, and that one did not interfere with the other at all. Benjamin believed that this was something completely different, in which case the conversation would be related to work, and the line between public and private would be erased. Grace called this trip a business expedition. But now, in the dark time of day, one thing was important: not to get lost in the pitch darkness. To avoid getting lost, Grace tied a white scarf to one of the trees, which could be seen from afar, even in the dark. Grace had tied white ribbons along many sections of the road to mark the trail, and now she and Benjamin were sure they couldn't get lost. The young man was surprised. The white scarves shone incredibly in the dark, suggesting that this was a new product from the workshop of magical artifacts. They were indeed covered in luminous paint, and fortunately, they turned out to be brighter than even the lady herself expected. Such a strong light only appears in complete darkness, and it was truly amazing. Grace wondered if the young gentleman had a passion for magical objects, which was why he was so interested in the white ribbons. Benjamin liked them very much, and in his opinion, magical objects brought convenience and comfort into people's lives. This is why Benjamin was interested in making sure that as many people as possible knew about magical artifacts. The heroine wondered if the young man would also encounter contradictions, and she was interested in how his investigation was progressing. Finally, they saw the coveted last white ribbon, which was located right next to the right place. Benjamin noticed that even in the darkness, it was clear that the land here was completely barren, and together, they approached an abandoned mine. Near the photo, there were signs of attempts to hide this place, and probably someone did not want the mine to have an owner. Benjamin asked my lady to stay as close as possible, because they were about to head to a completely unknown place. The walls of the mine, covered with moss and lichen, seemed alive, and the moonlight gave them a mysterious look, and Benjamin turned on the flashlight and illuminated the entrance leading inside. It was quiet inside. Only the sound of their footsteps broke the silence. Grace felt her heart pounding with excitement and fear. Grace suddenly stopped and asked what it was, as if she saw something unusual in front of her. Benjamin replied that he felt strange, and a huge shiver ran down his spine. As they moved deeper into the mine, avoiding debris and trying not to trip, Grace suddenly noticed something shiny on the floor. Indeed, something was glowing among the stones, which immediately attracted the girl's attention. Benjamin asked the lady to remain standing nearby, and he himself decided to go first and check what it was. The stone was extraordinarily beautiful, its bright blue color shimmering in the light of the flashlight, as if the very essence of heavenly light was contained within it. It was a strange feeling, as if the stone contained some ancient power. Looking at the stone, Grace guessed that it looked more like a precious stone than an ordinary one, and one might well think that it was a magical stone. But there was a slight difference, and in order to identify the stone, it was still necessary to call an expert so that he could tell us all the details about it. Suddenly, Grace shouted something and asked Benjamin to stop for a moment and take a look. She took Benjamin's hand and pulled him towards her, wanting to look at the precious stone she had found. She looked at the mineral she had found with enthusiasm and noticed something unusual about this stone. When the light hit one side, the color of the stone changed like the northern lights, and Grace found it incredibly beautiful. Benjamin felt embarrassed, because it seemed to him that he and the lady were becoming closer every day. This stone turned out to be truly charming, and the heroine still couldn't take her eyes off it. For some reason, Grace felt very shy around Benjamin today, and she suddenly asked if they could consider buying the mine. By acquiring this mine, they would certainly be able to improve their financial situation. But first, proposals must be sent to the imperial court, and they should probably have first approached the crown prince, who would hardly be happy to take on this matter. Grace assumed that the young man had decided to take advantage of the situation and dump all the annoying hassle on the imperial court. Judging by his actions, the Duke was definitely not so simple and thought out many steps in advance. Benjamin also suggested taking the magic stone with them to confirm its presence in the mine, and then figure out how to use it. She looked at her husband, and for some reason, now he was incredibly handsome and attractive. But Grace felt that she was not at all his equal. When all the boxes of aid had been laid out, it became clear that Duke Zart had not been stingy at all and had sent a large quantity. Gray remembered that in the original story, there was not enough help, but in front of her, she saw a huge number of boxes with the most necessary things. Also included with the humanitarian aid was a gift addressed specifically to the Duke and Duchess of Felton, presented in a beautiful gilded gift box. Given the seriousness of the situation, the young man immediately agreed to consider the possibility of donating the Duke's gifts. Grace agreed with her husband's opinion that since they would have to travel a long distance, it was better not to overexert themselves. Now Grace and Benjamin were not alone, and next to them stood a young man who wanted to help. Suddenly, a young man's voice was heard behind them, and Mr. Felton immediately turned around. It was a young man in a white suit with long white hair, and he was probably a temple minister. Mrs. Grace recognized the man, and she even knew the young man's name, Boris Benedict. Since this holy man was here, Arya was probably somewhere nearby too. Grace really liked Boris, although not as much as the main character, but he was someone she could always rely on. He was Arya's support and protector, in other words, a reliable supporting character who treated everyone with great respect. They received gifts from Duke Zart, and this help turned out to be absolutely necessary. The consequences of the pollution for the inhabitants of the Empire were extremely severe, so Grace racked her brains to think of how to help using all her gifts. Boris called the lady a truly kind person, because not everyone would dare to do such things. He asked her to ask for help at any time if she needed it, and many people would be happy to help her. These words served as the trigger. And that evening, Arya could not find one very important thing in her suitcase. She knew for sure that this thing was in the black suitcase, but she was very afraid that an accident had happened to it. Grace felt like it was getting too noisy nearby, and saw people standing nearby. These were the knights of the temple and the clergy, who for some reason had gathered in one place. Sally had to ask, so she inquired if something had happened, and as she discovered, the saint had recently been robbed. This incident definitely didn't happen in the original, and Grace was absolutely sure of it. She asked what exactly had been stolen, as it could be a clue to the mystery robber. And now the gift that the saint received from Duke Zart, and when the Duke becomes aware of this incident, he may regard it as an act of disrespect. But Grace was sure that the Duke's assistance was not mentioned in the original, and this definitely could not have happened. The lady asked if she could help with anything, and Saint Arya had already heard a familiar voice. She turned away because she and the Duchess of Felton had met under very strange circumstances. The young man reported that they had received an order to inspect the place and must carry it out as quickly as possible. Sally shielded Mistress Grace and screamed, asking if anyone suspected her of deception if she had been ordered to inspect these lands. Rosalia came out right in front of the young man with the same question. Did anyone really have any suspicions? The ladies defended their mistress, and Grace was very worried that she could cause them big problems. Rosalia told the man that he would be obliged to apologize to the lady if there was nothing in her chambers. The fear was not in vain, and after some time, the young man reported an interesting thing he had found. In his hands was a necklace that the saint had received as a gift, and the young man was looking for it. Grace wondered how the precious necklace had ended up in that place in the first place, and whether she would be held responsible for the theft. Everyone began to whisper that this girl was accused of trying to steal a holy thing, and everyone asked the Duchess of Felton to explain herself. Grace insisted she knew nothing and was simply handing out food along with the maid Sally, having nothing to do with the leather necklace. But suddenly she heard a familiar voice, and it was Benjamin, asking the girl to look into his eyes. In front of everyone, the young man declared that he believed his wife and asked her to tell him everything she really knew. Seeing the unwavering support before her, Grace gathered her strength and decided to tell the whole truth and no longer be afraid of anything, because those around her undoubtedly trust her. And since she touched the stolen item, her fingerprints should probably have remained on the necklace. Grace asked the maid to immediately bring powder to prove her non-involvement and innocence in this crime. Sally enthusiastically set off to look for powder, and now the lady needed her urgent help more than ever. She demanded to look at the box. He promised that he would not break it under any circumstances, promising that everything would be intact. She asked Benjamin, whose hands were in white gloves, to hold the precious box while she was about to open it. No one had touched the box before, and if the Duchess had indeed stolen it, her fingerprints would appear on it. And if there is no evidence, the young man will have to come up with an excuse for himself, because in that case, he will be accused of slandering the Duchess herself. The lady carefully brushed the necklace with a special brush, after which fingerprints should have appeared. The Knights of the Temple and Benjamin were definitely wearing gloves, so their fingerprints definitely shouldn't show up. Grace knew that gifts like these were usually polished to a high shine, so if fingerprints were visible, they were more likely to belong to the criminal. She looked closely at the necklace and finally found the very piece she had been looking for so long. On the tip of each person's finger, there is a pattern that is unique. Grace showed her fingerprint and said that this way, they could easily identify the criminal. They leave fingerprints only if the hand is not covered, and they only saw bare hands on one of the priests. Grace offered to compare the fingerprints, but did not assure that this particular young man was the culprit. But if the fingerprints were identical, then charges would be brought against him. In this case, the young man will be called a criminal, and the lady will file a complaint with the temple and tell the whole truth. The culprit really turned out to be that same priest, and after this incident, things went smoothly, and Boris apologized. However, his excessive calm suggested that the influence of the temple was much greater in this place, so Benedict apologized properly and then disappeared. The crown prince invited Arya to come with him, promising that all the difficulties and obstacles were finally over. But looking at the girl, he saw her pale expression and immediately asked if everything was okay with her. Arya actually looked confused, and her attention was focused on the red-haired girl. She approached the Duchess, probably wanting to ask her something, and was clearly interested in her person. Arya admitted that she was completely fine, and her strength was gradually being restored. She offered her hand to the crown prince and called him by the tender name of Sylvie, and Grace was surprised by such a gesture. In the original story, today Arya and Crown Prince Sylvester entered the Night Forest and met at the lake, but Grace did not think that there was a lake somewhere in the Dead Land. Grace wondered if Arya could purify water as much as she wanted, and suddenly she could smell the water herself. Walking a little further, she felt that she was approaching some kind of lake, and it definitely had to be located here. That night, holding hands, in this dark place were two lovers, whose strong aura cleared this place. Smelling the freshness of the cool water, Grace saw Sylvester and Arya from afar, who were indeed sitting in front of the crystal-clear lake. They really did look like the main characters, and I even noticed that it was as if the world was created just for the two of them. Grace was surprised, but the Minu was still there, offering to discuss a little later why they had come here late at night. Sylvester and Arya were having a nice conversation as they sat by the cool lake, enjoying every moment they spent with each other. Benjamin suddenly muttered something, but Grace barely heard his last words. The young man admitted that he was incredibly envious of the young lovers, and he really looked at them with a certain sadness. Grace remembered that Benjamin's bitter feelings of loneliness were described on a whole page of the novel. For some reason, the lady now felt that the young man's emotions had become too subtle, as if they were about to evaporate. So she decided to distract the young man and go together to greet the saint, who had incredibly helped these lands. It turned out that Grace had worried for nothing, and the young man agreed to her every request. She apologized and took off her emerald brooch so as not to spoil the first impression. Grace and Benjamin did not go unnoticed, and the next moment they were looking at the frightened faces of Arya and the crown prince. Benjamin smiled and apologized for catching them out for a walk, and if they had disturbed him with their company, then they would definitely leave. They certainly didn't expect anyone to see them together, much less Mr. Benjamin. Arya, on the contrary, happily agreed to chat with everyone together, because she was also acquainted with Mr. Felton and his wife. Grace didn't think they would be happy to see her, but she still needed to talk to her. She confided in Benjamin that she had a couple of questions for Arya and would like to step away with her for a minute. When the girls were finally alone, Grace admitted that she had wanted to introduce herself for a long time, but the circumstances were not right. Looking at the lady with sincere eyes, Arya admitted that she was also incredibly happy to meet her and had been wanting to make friends with her for a long time. Grace didn't expect to hear that the saint also wanted to meet her, and for her it was now a surprise. But Arya really admitted that she wanted to become friends with the Duchess, but she never had the opportunity to communicate. Arya wanted to confess to Grace sincerely, but she was afraid that her words might sound too strange. The saint warned, all her words are very important, and in her eyes the state of the Duchess is the same as that of the Crown Prince. She said that when she first arrived at the Randall Canal, she immediately noticed something unusual there. Arya used divine power to get rid of the pollution, but at one point, something strange happened. In an instant, everything began to change, and the saint turned her attention to the lady standing nearby. Grace also felt something special, as if magical magic was penetrating through her and dissolving inside. Arya saw how the black fog that surrounded the lady dissipated, and now there was a pure and bright aura around her. The black fog was Sylvester's curse as described in the original, but was the curse not only cast on the prince? Now Grace realized that the black fog only meant that the curse had been cast on her as well. Arya clearly saw the fog dissipate, but now it seemed to surround her again, and she could feel an energy that was similar to the energy of a saint. The lady had absolutely no idea what Arya meant when she spoke of the similar energy between them. Arya claimed that she felt a divine power that clearly emanated from the lady. The saint was well acquainted with these sensations, since she herself possessed divine power and could not confuse it with anything else. Grace was sure that Arya was simply mistaken, and in each generation only one saint is born. For some reason, Arya claimed to feel a powerful energy, but then apologized for such a strange conversation. Despite the shocking story, Arya was portrayed exactly as she was told in the original. And now she saw in front of her a naive and kind girl who was so noble and only wanted to help everyone. Grace noticed that Arya was clearly upset and confused, but she still cared about her mistress and her condition. It was already quite late outside, so the lady decided to say goodbye, promising to chat again another time. Arya was genuinely happy to hear these words and admitted that she would look forward to meeting again. To make matters even more confusing, it was now revealed that Grace was cursed, but at the same time, she had magical powers. The next day, Grace went to the train station that led to Viscount Linden's estate. Sally thoughtfully suggested that the lady read the morning news in the newspaper, as she should probably be aware of the latest events. Grace took the latest issue and thanked the maid for her attentive care. The first thing she decided to do was to see if there was any news about the Duchess of Felton. But to her great surprise, there was absolutely no news written about the Duchess, and this was quite strange. Grace wondered if the only thing of interest here was that high-profile kidnapping case. After reading the latest news, the Duchess began to think that the world was truly frightening lately. Benjamin warned of his imminent arrival at the Viscount's estate, so Grace needed to get ready for the meeting. Viscount Linden's estate was an incredibly beautiful place. Surrounded by high mountains, there was a small area with a lovely lake, and it was an ordinary estate. If you don't take into account the legend that you can be cured of any disease here. She stopped near the building and realized that she felt a strong sense of excitement, because right now she was standing near that very estate. Grace missed this estate so incredibly, and the heroine felt like she was ready to burst into tears. Benjamin stood next to his wife and saw her surprised face, even afraid to ask anything at that moment. He suggested that we look around the local shops and, if my lady didn't mind, take a little walk. He had heard that there was a period every year at the Linden estate when traders stayed longer than usual, and now was the time. The lady compared the scale of the festival and was sure that it was not as fun as on the island. The shopping arcades stretched along the entire main street, and the range of goods was quite extensive. Grace and Benjamin walked slowly through the shopping arcades, carefully examining what the merchants were offering. The lady noticed that there were a lot of strange things at the market, and upon seeing them, she was very much delighted. Her attention was drawn to the strange red fruits, which she saw for the first time in her life. The merchant said that this fruit is called Scasandora, and it was brought from the kingdom of Arcia. It was a rather rare berry for these parts, and Grace was incredibly eager to try it. Having put one berry in her mouth, the lady immediately felt its incredibly strange taste and realized what kind of berry was in front of her. This taste was quite familiar to her, but for some reason, the merchant gave this berry a completely different name. Grace tasted Schisandra chinensis, but she didn't understand where it came from, and this was very unexpected. Benjamin thought the lady clearly didn't like the taste of the berry, but Grace replied that the berry was very tasty. As soon as Benjamin heard that his wife liked these berries, he immediately came up with something. The young man did not think long, and told the merchant that they were going to buy all the red berries that the lady had just liked. The lady also offered to buy seeds and asked the merchant how to grow such tasty and aromatic berries. Benjamin was ready to buy anything for my lady, and asked her to address him by name, since they were among people. Hearing these words, for some reason, Grace felt warmth inside and was happy, calling the young man by the affectionate name Benny. The Duke really liked it when his wife called him that, and he was ready to hear his name every minute. At the threshold of the luxurious palace, they were met by Viscountess Linden, Grace's mother, who was incredibly happy to see the young couple. Seeing the gift boxes and pile of purchases, the lady noted that the young people had not wasted their time and asked them not to forget to enjoy the beautiful night views. There was no great enthusiasm on the heroine's face when she met her mother, and this was probably because of her memories. The lady admitted that she was sure that Grace was doing well in life and that she still loved flowers. Holding a bouquet, Grace admitted that they would like to have dinner a little later, as there were so many different delicacies at the market. She stopped near a family portrait that depicted all the members of the Linden family. The heroine noticed that the family portrait had not been updated for a long time, and Mrs. Grace looked completely different in it. In the portrait, Grace looks like an ugly duckling compared to her attractive sister and cute brother. Perhaps it was all about Grace's sense of inferiority, but for some reason, this family made the lady feel uncomfortable. Grace decided not to think about anything extraneous anymore and just wanted to head to her room to rest. But suddenly, she realized that when a couple came to visit, they were given one separate room, and she would probably have to live with Benjamin. Indeed, they were given one room, and there was even one large bed there, which was intended for married couples. Mother Grace admitted that it was probably not as tidy here as in the duchy, but she very much hoped that they would rest in comfort. Benjamin was also surprised that they were given only one room, and now they would become able to look at each other. He suggested that his wife ask for another room if she felt uncomfortable being around him. Grace was sure that this would hardly work, because there were not so many rooms in the estate. Then the young man thought and came up with another idea that he could offer to the lady. Grace stood there in bewilderment, waiting for Benjamin to tell her about his plans, because it was very unexpected for her. Benjamin said he could sleep on the couch, and then Grace wouldn't feel uncomfortable sleeping alone on the bed. Looking at the sofa, the heroine realized that there was very little space there, and it would probably be uncomfortable for the young man to sleep there. Benjamin lay down on the sofa and admitted that he would find out about it later, and perhaps he would even like to sleep there. They both laughed, and the sofa would indeed be too cramped for the young man, and he shouldn't even try to stay there to sleep. Laughing, Benjamin replied that his wife was probably right, in which case she suggested that he lie down on the sofa himself. The young man insisted that the girl might have back pain, but now he himself did not want to let her sit on the hard, uncomfortable sofa. And Grace didn't want Benjamin to be uncomfortable, so she suggested that they sleep together on the bed, and that there was nothing wrong with that. After these words, the lady felt awkward, and her face turned red from intense embarrassment. Grace and her boyfriend went to a family dinner party and made themselves comfortable in the guest dining room. Mother Linden thanked the Duke for the fact that her daughter was living well in the duchy, and she even prepared a delicious pie for dessert on the occasion of her arrival. But suddenly, she admitted that she had probably done it in vain, and Grace felt an unpleasant sensation when her mother looked at her. She again heard reproaches in her words, and the year in which they did not communicate passed in silence and calm. But if we paraphrase her words, the mother hinted at her daughter's unworthy appearance, deciding that all she did was gorge herself on desserts. Grace constantly heard caustic phrases from her mother, which pierced her heart like a sharp knife. Now the heroine felt an unpleasant aftertaste, and she understood that if she began to cling to the lady's words, then everyone would decide that she had overreacted. At this point, Benjamin suddenly intervened and told Mother Grace that the lady had not eaten dessert after the main course for a long time. And as far as he knows, the Viscount's estate is spoken of very highly, so the young man can't wait to try the first course. Grace saw that Benjamin understood everything, and that is why he fought back against her mother right in front of everyone. After a hearty dinner, the lady felt a little unwell, as if her stomach weighed about a ton. She went outside to get some fresh air, and her stomach was growling terribly loudly. The heroine didn't understand what was going on, and for some reason, she couldn't even eat normally and immediately began to feel ill. Behind her, she heard someone calling her name and turned around to see who was there. She saw in front of her a sweet, fair-haired lady who, in a gentle voice, admitted that she missed Grace incredibly because there had been no news from her for a whole year. It was Gloria, and she had come to see her sister, saying that she was very sorry that they had not been able to have dinner together. She admitted that her sister no longer looks like that awkward girl, but now looks like a real lady. Grace confidently replied that she had completely forgotten those constant moments from the past, when children laughed at her and called her names. Gloria looked at Grace carefully and apologized for thinking something when they first met. The lady asked Gloria if something had happened and was very eager to hear what she had to tell her. Suddenly, Gloria asked her sister to find any information about Baron Lamontier, and the lady was surprised that she was not married to Count Farmo. Gloria admitted that she really needed this information, and as a girl, she had to understand it. Her sister was very scared, and Grace didn't quite understand what was going on. But since Gloria asked her to, she needed to find out all the information. All night she thought about yesterday's conversation with her sister, who asked her to find information about Baron Lamontier, and the lady even suspected that perhaps this young man could pester her. In the morning, Benjamin immediately found the lady, who wanted to know if they had a good talk with his sister yesterday, because she probably missed her very much. For some reason, Benjamin looked very pitiful today, as if he hadn't slept all night and had been talking to one of his relatives. Grace admitted that after talking with her sister, she had one thought: she would like to return to social life. Therefore, she wanted to take advantage of her connections with the younger Marquis Charles, with whom Benjamin had good relations. But he was a man from the boy's past that he would rather not remember, and he asked Grace not to ask what had happened between them. The young man knew that the man's wife was about to give birth to a child, and that a social event would soon be held to celebrate the birth of the baby. The celebration is held to wish the mother a safe delivery, and traditionally, the festival could be attended either by pregnant women or by ladies with an invitation. Now all that remained was to obtain an invitation, and this would probably be difficult, since the Count was not close to the younger Marquise. The lady asked if she could invite Gloria and wanted to find out some information. She asked Benjamin if he knew Count Farmo, as she was supposedly very interested in learning about her sister's husband. They weren't close friends, and it was hard for Benjamin to tell, but he knew the young man was supporting the crown prince. Without missing a beat, Grace immediately asked about Baron Lamontier, as Benjamin might also have information. But in response, the Duke only expressed surprise, declaring that he had never even heard of such a surname. The lady had been counting on the young man for the junior Marquise's celebration, as she needed to get into high society, but now she knew that Benjamin knew nothing at all about that aristocrat. On the last day of his stay with the Viscount, the worst happened, and in one day, everything went wrong. Benjamin was waiting at Grace's door, but this morning, for some reason, my lady was very late. The butler approached him and asked the gentleman for a minute of his time, and it seemed as if he knew something. Suddenly, the Viscount, whose daughter Grace was, entered and in a frightened voice declared that something terrible had happened that night, and that someone had kidnapped his own daughter Grace. The news was incredibly shocking to the young Duke of Felton, and he never expected to hear that his wife would be kidnapped from her own home. And now the young man was determined to get Grace back, despite all the obstacles, and was ready to face any dangers to save his wife and unravel the mysteries.